Hellenic History by George Willis Botsford. Chapter 25. Social Aspects of the State, 404 to 337. Growth of Individualism. The growth of individualism, which characterized the various activities of the 4th century, fostered the development not only of democracy, but of monarchy. In the political disintegration resulting from the decline, first of the Athenian, then of the Lacedaemonian power, tyrannies sprang up in some of the smaller states, and in western Hellas the feebleness of the socialistic democracy of Syracuse, in the face of the Carthaginian peril, made possible the creation of a tyrannic empire, which in extent and power was thus far unparalleled in Hellas. At the same time, in the minds of the educated, who like Xenophon had by travel seen the advantages of monarchy, or, like Isocrates and Plato, had brooded over the evils of the existing state system, there developed a sentiment in favor of one-man rule. Statesman and general. Notwithstanding these favoring conditions, tyranny was less frequent in the 4th century than it had been in the 7th and 6th. The accumulation of knowledge, with its organization in departments, led to a corresponding specialization of activities. Statesman and general were clearly differentiated. The former was now a trained orator with a special knowledge of finance and of international administration, whereas the military leader had to acquire a knowledge of the science of art and war unknown to former ages. Hence, as a rule, it was no longer possible for a demagogue to command the means of making himself tyrant, and the republican form of government thereby gained stability. Prevailing forms of government. Aristocracy, in which a few good men ruled unselfishly and wisely for the general advantage of the community, was more a dream of the political theorist than a historical reality. Certainly in the 4th century little if any vestige of it existed, nor could a man of practical sense look upon it as among the possibilities of the future. The prevailing forms of government were oligarchy and democracy. With them the statesman, and any thinker above the mere visionary, had to deal as conditions capable of improvement, but too deeply seated to be cast aside. Of these two types of republic there were many varieties and gradations, so that to pronounce an unqualified judgment upon either would betray a lack of discrimination. Governmental adjustment. The Constitution hinged upon property and its distribution. The rich aimed not only to preserve their estates, but also to exploit the government and the masses for their own economic profit, whereas the poor were not content with protecting themselves from the aggression of others, but strove to convert more or less of the property of the rich to the use of the state and of themselves. There existed, too, from early time a middle class, chiefly farmers in comfortable circumstances, fairly satisfied with their condition and opposed to both oligarchic and democratic extremes. Political philosophers, such as Aristotle, and practical statesmen of broad intelligence concern themselves with methods of preserving an equilibrium of these social forces, that neither extreme might gain the upper hand. Often the balance was upset by losses in war, often by economic adversity or prosperity, and sometimes by an injudicious admission of aliens to citizenship. Against all such disturbances a statesman had to provide. His chief means was governmental adjustment, the distribution of offices and functions in such a way as to permit neither party to usurp a power over the other. At Tarentum and at Athens, for example, the offices were grouped in two classes, one filled by vote, the other by lot, the first for the better administration of the state, the second to guarantee to the poor a share in the government. Oligarchy. In the degree that a constitution departed from this balance in either direction, it became unjust and oppressive. Only the extreme oligarchy, however, or the extreme democracy, was absolutely reprehensible, and neither of these types was frequent. As in oligarchy, the government was operated in the interest of a minority. This form of constitution was the less equitable of the two. The few were always the wealthy, and enjoyed therefore an excellent opportunity, while assuring to themselves a permanent lease of power, to benefit and adorn the state and to awaken the gratitude of the masses. It is fitting that magistrates on entering office should offer magnificent sacrifices or erect some public building, and then the people who participate in the entertainments, and like to see the city decorated with votive offerings and buildings, will not desire an alteration in the government, and the notables will have memorials of their munificence. This, however, is anything but the fashion of our modern oligarchs, who are as covetous of gain as they are of honor. Insolent and avaricious, they used office as a means of profit in the misappropriation of public funds, or in the practice of extortion and judicial oppression upon private persons. It was the feeling that the public moneys were being stolen, rather than their own exclusion from office, which drove the masses to revolt against oligarchic governments. Added to the economic grievance was the intense hatred of the few for the many, expressed in the oligarchic oath sworn in many states. I will be an enemy of the people, and will do against them all the harm I can. This fiendish rancor is sufficiently illustrated by the rule of the 30 at Athens and by the Decharches in the Aegean cities. Now, as in the preceding century, the rule of the few meant not only an utter want of justice for the many, but a policy directed to their enslavement. Democracy. The other form of government, even more common than oligarchy in the 4th century, was democracy, in which the indigent and not the men of property had the political power in their hands. In other words, democracy was a government of the many in their own interest. This is the extreme variety of the type, of which there were several relatively commendable forms. In one of his classifications, Aristotle enumerates 5 kinds of democracy. Of 4 kinds he approves, as all are under the laws. But the 5th form is that in which not the laws but the multitude rule, in which the law has been superseded by mere resolutions of the people. Among the sound forms of democracy were those of pastoral and agricultural peoples. They were robust in body, able to endure the fatigues of marching and fighting, and possessed therefore the highest degree of military virtue. Scattered over the country and engaged in their daily labor, they could not often meet in assembly. Once or twice a year they could gather for the election of officials, or for other public functions of like importance, but were compelled to leave the current administration to magistrates and council. Under such circumstances, officials were usually elected on the ground of fitness, and the government was wisely conducted. These economic conditions still prevailed over a large part of the Greek peninsula, as Aetolia, Achaia, and Arcadia. An advance toward pure democracy, individualistic developments. Industrial states, however, had advanced beyond such conditions in the direction of pure democracy. Mechanics of every description, plying their various trades within the city, readily found leisure to attend the assembly, and the aged men of their families could sit year after year in the law courts. Large revenues enabled the government to pay for official service and even for attendance at the assembly. This condition resulted in part from a natural historical growth, the gradual diffusion of intelligence which endowed an ever-increasing number of the population with political capacity. It came in part, too, as a correction of political wrongs committed by earlier ruling minorities who were too narrow and self-seeking to interest themselves in the commons, and partly through the desire of sincere humanitarian statesmen, as Pericles, for the economic, cultural, and political elevation of the masses. The evils of democracy, however, were aggravated by the operation of causes which 5th century statesmen could not well foresee. Individualistic developments, beginning in earlier time, drew a large proportion of the citizens of the wealthier classes from politics. Many young men of eupatriid rank now cared only for gambling and low company. A bourgeoisie recruited from the poorest class and nursed into great prosperity by an expanding city economy could not neglect business for the service of the state in office or assembly. The duality of thought and action, noticeable in Euripides, became more and more pronounced as life grew more complex and specialized. In the degree, therefore, that a man devoted himself to philosophy or literature, he unfitted himself for everything else. The thinker stood as far removed from the politician as the orator from the general. The pursuit of individualistic aims deprived the state of the service and guidance of its more intelligent and cultured citizens, leaving it to the mercy of professional politicians, who commanded the votes of the poorer and less enlightened minority. For the political evils of which 4th century writers bitterly complain, they and their class were chiefly responsible, inasmuch as their own aloofness from public affairs left the democracy unbridled. The conditions lamented by conservatives, however, were a symptom and a cause of a vast political evolution slowly and silently underway throughout Hellas. The broadening humanity, the waning interest in local politics, and the aversion of cultured citizens from military life meant the decline of the polis and the development of a larger and more liberal state system, the preparation of a transition from regional to world politics, from racial to cosmopolitan culture. Athens, a highly developed democracy. It is only in the case of Athens that existing knowledge affords a view of the working of a highly developed democracy in sufficient detail to enable us to pronounce a judgment of its character. For the reason already given, ancient historians and philosophers were generally unfavorable, whereas the speakers before the assembly and courts were disposed to flatter the masses. Allowance has therefore to be made for the bias of both classes of authorities. The violence of the 400, and still more of the 30, had disgusted the moderates with oligarchic methods and had assured the popular government a permanent lease of power. The democratic restoration in 403 was therefore thoroughgoing. Against an effort on the one hand to limit the franchise to landowners, and on the other to extend the citizenship to all, including even slaves, who had aided the overthrow of the 30, conservative statesmen forced the government into its old democratic ruts. Their renewal of the Periclean law of 451, which limited the citizenship to those whose parents were both Athenians, was dictated partly by a narrow selfishness of the majority, partly too by religious interest in the purity of the race. In fact, the political restoration is to be connected with the revival of religion apparent in the last drama of Euripides. The condemnation and death of Socrates, 399, on the charge of repudiating the gods of the state, of introducing new divinities, and of corrupting the youth, the sacrifice on the altar of this revival, of the staunchest defender of religion and of virtue among the enlightened, was a strange piece of historical irony, and perhaps the severest blow inflicted by ancient democracy upon itself, for nothing so alienated the intellectual class. The democratic government proclaimed to those who had sided with the 30 an amnesty, which was generally kept. Democrats who had been robbed of their estates lived as peaceful neighbors of aristocrats who had shared the spoils. Some hard feeling, stirred especially by renegades from the party of the 30, hindered oligarchs from office and prejudiced juries against them. But all hatred gradually died out with the generation that had lived through the crisis. Pay for attendance at assembly. It was the growing disinclination to politics, as well as the principle that all state services should be paid so that the poor might share in them, which led Agirius early in the 4th century to institute a fee for attendance at the assembly. From 1 obol it was soon raised to 3. On this basis it was easy to reason that the common citizen had as good a right as any to the public festivals. He ought therefore to be given free admission to the theater and to be served with food at the public expense while attending the Panathenaea or other festivals, and even to be paid in money for the time he takes for these pleasures from his daily toil. Inevitably the appropriation, at first moderate, gradually increased till it swallowed up the entire surplus income of the state. The effect was to weaken Athens in her relations with foreigners, and to render the recipients less capable of caring for themselves. Aristotle's idea of caring for the poor. The effort to alleviate the condition of the poor is not itself to be condemned, but rather the improvident method of distributing the aid. Where there are revenues, the demagogues should not be allowed after their manner to distribute the surplus. The poor are always receiving and always wanting more and more, for such help is like water poured into a leaky cask. Yet the true friend of the people should see that they be not too poor, for extreme poverty lowers the character of the democracy. Measures should be taken which shall give them lasting prosperity, and as this end is equally the interest of all classes, the proceeds of the public revenues should be accumulated and distributed among them, if possible, in such amounts as may enable them to purchase a little farm, or at all events make a beginning in trade or husbandry. If this benevolence cannot be extended to all, money should be distributed in turn according to tribes or other groups, and meantime the rich should pay the fee for attendance of the poor at the necessary assemblies, and should in return be excused from useless public services. It is noteworthy that in the passage here quoted, Aristotle holds that the poor owed their condition to no fundamental defect of their own, and that if given a new start in life, they would as a rule prove themselves worthy of the aid. In fact, he nowhere blames the people for the faults of the democracy. Even if they have no share in office, the poor, provided only they are not outraged or deprived of their property, will be quiet enough. Whereas wealth and power, says Isocrates, are attended and followed by a lack of sense and by license, want and a humble position bring with them prudence and moderation, so that it is hard to decide which of these two lots one would prefer to leave as a legacy to one's children. For the shortcomings of democracy, the demagogues were chiefly responsible. The commons lacked the special knowledge now more necessary than ever for judging of foreign policies. In such matters, they had to trust their leaders, who often misinformed them. In domestic affairs, too, unprincipled demagogues often attempted to work upon their political prejudices and their covetousness to the detriment especially of wealthy individuals. Confiscated property. It was charged that pettifoggers sometimes appealed to the juries to condemn the accused on the ground that if his property should not be confiscated, there would be no means of paying them for their service. The first intimation of this practice appears in the Knights of Aristophanes, early in the Peloponnesian War. In the period now before us, a speaker addresses the jury as follows: "It must be borne in mind that you have often heard these men say, whenever they wished you to condemn someone unjustly, that unless you vote the condemnation of those whom they order, your pay will be lacking." Another asserts that the council, when in need of money for the current administration, was inclined to condemn the men impeached before it, and to confiscate their property. Such cases must have occurred. One or two instances, however, in a half-century would suffice to account for the charges that appear in literature. The speakers above mentioned assume that pleas of the kind are repugnant to the moral sense of the jurors whom they are addressing. Hence, they could not often have been used effectively. And in fact, we do not know by name any person who thus suffered. To the honor of the democracy, Aristotle has testified. Even the jurisdiction has passed from the council to the people. And in this matter they seem to act rightly, for the few are more corruptible than the many, whether by money or by influence. It was a grievous wrong if one or two innocent men were put to death by the avarice of council or jury, but it is not a sufficient reason for condemning the Athenian democracy, for in no age or country has the administration of justice been perfect. Class consciousness. In the old days of the democracy, many a man of wealth lived moderately, nearly on a level with the poor, and was notably generous and hospitable. To the end of the present period, a large class of the wealthy retained the same character. During the 4th century, however, the growth of culture and of luxury developed a class consciousness. Priding themselves on their refinement, educated men of means despised those who in youth had been compelled to labor instead of attending school. In this spirit, Demosthenes the orator contrasts his own early life with that of his opponent Aeschines. After rehearsing his own education and his entrance upon a public career, he turns upon his adversary with these words: "But you, august man, who now spit upon others, consider what fortune you enjoyed, through which in boyhood you were reared in dire poverty, assisting your father in the schoolroom, grinding ink, sponging off seats, and sweeping the room, occupying the post of a slave, not of a free lad. Compare these two lives, Aeschines, yours and mine, with each other, calmly, but not in bitterness, and ask these jurors which of the two fortunes each one of them would prefer. You taught reading, I attended school. You performed initiations, I was initiated. You danced, I was choregus. You were a public scribe, I a public orator. You were a third-rate actor, I witnessed the play. You failed in your part, and I hissed you. The antipathy was increased not only by the widening differentiation of society into rich and poor, educated and ignorant, but also by the gathering of the people into the city. Whoever is poor and wants to live in the city brings all the more discouragement upon himself, for when he beholds a man who is able to live in luxury and ease, he is then in a position to see in his own case how wretched and toilsome is the life he leads. The sight, too, of many increasing their wealth by dishonest means created in the poor the exaggerated notion that fortunes accumulated by individuals were all due to cheating. Cremulus. I've been a virtuous and religious man, yet always poor and luckless. Cario. So you have. Cremulus. While temple breakers, orators, informers, and knaves grow rich and prosper. Cario. So they do. The reason is that Plutus is blind and has made a wrong distribution of wealth. By passing a night in the temple of Asclepius, he receives his sight and proceeds forthwith to a bestowal of this world's goods upon the deserving. Socialistic tendencies. Never before in the history of the world were the masses so conscious of these economic social contrasts or of their own power. Under these circumstances, it was but natural that they, the controlling majority, should bring to the front a program more or less socialistic. Upon one thing at least they were determined, that the wealthy man in office should no longer exploit them for his own profit, that out of office the rich should not make an insolent display of their wealth. In illustration we may cite the law of Lycurgus, which ordered that women should not ride in carriages to Eleusis at the time of the festival, lest the poor appear more despicable than the rich. Another plank in their platform required the wealthy, willing or unwilling, to contribute liberally from their abundance in the performance of both naval and festive liturgies, and in the payment of direct taxes in time of war according to their means. The amount of pressure thus brought upon the rich varied in different states and in the same state at different times. In Athens, the abundance of the ordinary revenues, added to the relative mildness of political feeling, generally assured to the wealthy an immunity from exactions. There as elsewhere, however, it was felt by many that inequality of property was the root of all evil, for which the only remedy was communism. The relation of the state to private property can be clearly understood by taking into account the nature of the polis as contrasted with that of the modern nation. Because of its general insecurity and lack of resources, the city-state necessarily exercised far more rigorously and arbitrarily its ultimate right of ownership over everything belonging to the citizens. This basic proprietorship it applied in the levy of extraordinary taxes, in temporary monopolies of some or all saleable commodities, in forced loans and contributions, and in various other ways. If the distribution of these burdens was but approximately equitable, the citizens could not complain, as property, life, family, and everything held dear rested wholly upon the security of the state. The Athenian democracy in the 4th century. The problem as to the soundness or decadence of the Athenian democracy in the 4th century has long been under controversy. One of the most pertinent questions involved is whether a citizen of Athens in this period, a man of honesty and good intentions, gifted with a fair degree of patriotism, public spirit, and neighborliness, could enjoy an acquired or inherited estate in peace and happiness. Was the state sufficiently free from social spite and intolerance, and from governmental oppression and exaction, to guarantee even to the wealthy individual liberty and the pursuit of happiness? The answer, derived from an examination of the facts, can only be an emphatic affirmative. It would be a mistake to identify Athens with the extreme democracy described by Aristotle. The normal character of her population and the equilibrium of her social classes have been set forth in the preceding chapter. The numerous middle class, together with the wealthy, ordinarily controlled politics. The absence of pay for attendance at the assembly of the demi threw this institution into the hands of the well-to-do, who thus managed the business of their rural communities and held its offices. With some modifications, the principle held for the state. The emoluments derived from attendance at the assembly and from membership of the council or less than the daily wages of an unskilled workman, whereas the salaries of officials fell short of the mechanic's pay. Hence it was that the assembly and the council were filled as a rule by men in good circumstances. The orators who addressed the assembly and guided its opinions, though generally private citizens, were as a rule men of property. In fact, the orators and officials came largely from families which through generations of public service had shown patriotism combined with a fitness for administrative work. Ancient democracy from the evolutionary standpoint. Instead of condemning ancient democracy because in some or in all respects it fell short of present governmental systems, it is fairer to estimate its value from the evolutionary standpoint. And in this view, we cannot but admire the vast advance made by the Greek states in the liberty, intelligence, and manliness of their citizens over the dead level of Orientalism. There is, in the world of today, no intelligent human being who would not prefer to have been a common citizen of Athens rather than of Persia or Egypt. From the 7th to the 4th century, the steady advance of democracy brought its benefits to an ever-widening circle of citizens. Progress was then blocked in part by a religious conservatism, which in 403 forced the wheels of the restored democracy back into 5th century grooves, in part by crude socialistic experimentation. But it is absurd to say that from this condition there could be no recovery, that of all people the Greeks alone were incapable of learning by experience. By no means the least evil in the situation was the indifferent or hostile attitude of some intellectuals, or the reactionary doctrines of others, who like Isocrates sought a cure for all internal ills in a return to the polity of Cleisthenes or of Solon. If centuries were required for the building up of modern parliamentary states, Athens needed at least a few more generations in which to accommodate justice and equality to the rule of the many. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Art and Intelligence in the 4th Century. Part 1. Art. Value of art for an appreciation of Greek history. For an appreciation of Greek history, the great value of art lies in the fact that it is a genuine expression of Hellenic character, not merely of the great static essentials, but also of the more delicate variations from age to age. Some of the forces at work in reshaping the art of the 4th century were political. Lacking imperial revenues, the Athenian state was poorer than in the age of Pericles, and could spend proportionally less on decorative works. The social democracy, too, in Athens as elsewhere, required a considerable share of the public income for the direct benefit of the masses. Individualism in art. These facts help account for the construction of great stone theaters and stadia in various Hellenic cities to the detriment of temple building. Many of the wealthy class preferred to spend their income on the erection and maintenance of more commodious and attractive dwellings, on funerary monuments or sculptured portraits of themselves and their kin. The growing individualism of art may be traced partly to these private enterprises, but far more to the general trend of education. With the enlargement of knowledge, the individual became freer from state, society, and tradition, and more conscious of his separate existence. This mental growth, in and out of philosophy, was accompanied by introspection, an inquiry into the nature of the individual, a study of the personality and of its character and modes of expression. Pheidias, it has been said, gave the statue a soul, or more concretely, endowed the marble with thought and feeling. This inner being, however, was not a personal but a communal aspiration. History had to await a Praxiteles and a Scopas for an expression of the transitory thought and feeling of the individual. Praxiteles. By mechanical criteria, it is usually possible to distinguish Praxitelian art from that of earlier times. A standing figure of the preceding century was essentially erect, any curve being a mere deviation from the vertical. A Praxitelian statue, however, usually leans against a tree trunk or other support, which is thus made a part of the sculpture. By such means, too, the curve becomes an essential rather than an accidental feature. The need of a prop is due to the use of marble in place of bronze. Equally tangible is the difference in the treatment of drapery. Whereas in the preceding century, the dress fell in sharply outlined parallel folds, in the Praxitelian drapery, the greater folds vary in direction and in prominence, and pass into one another through smaller curves. The treatment of the hair undergoes a corresponding change. In the Phaedian period, the short hair of men lay flat on the head, running in parallel lines and terminating in crisp curls. That of Praxiteles is wrought throughout in fluffy locks. The surface of the body, too, is rendered with a natural elasticity equaled in no other extant sculpture. All these external features are due to a more careful study of texture, whether of cloth, hair, or human flesh, and to an advancing technique. Hermes of Praxiteles. The soul of a Praxitelian statue, however, we can recognize but can explain in no mechanical way. The body has a restful attitude. The person seems happy, musing, content with himself and the world. The only extant original statue is a mutilated Hermes found in an excavation at Olympia. On his left arm he holds the infant Dionysus. With his right hand he raises high a bunch of grapes or other object to amuse the child. Hermes is not looking at Dionysus, however, but at some object beyond, momentarily lost in pleasant thought. A youth in splendid athletic training and accustomed to activity, he is for the time being in repose. All the technical qualities above described this statue represents to perfection. It is a noteworthy fact, too, that in viewing this piece of art we forget that we are looking upon a god, for we can regard him as only a perfect human youth. The striving of Hellenic genius for individuality, thus displayed, in no way tended toward the elevation of man to divinity, but achieved instead the reduction of God to the human plane. Far from steeling the will to endurance or to heroic effort, it encouraged pleasant relations with the deity and a quiet contentment with life. This was in brief the prevailing spirit of Athens in the middle of the 4th century, within the lifetime of Praxiteles. Aphrodite of Cnidus. His most famous woman statue is the Aphrodite of Cnidus, of which we have but a Roman copy. The attitude of musing is Praxitelian, but all the finer qualities of the original were lost in copying. It is extremely unfortunate that we are obliged to depend almost wholly upon poor Roman copies for our acquaintance with the works of the greatest sculptors. Because of the inferior medium of contact, we are in no position to appreciate the extraordinary enthusiasm aroused by the original of this Aphrodite. Scopas. An artist of equal genius was Scopas. Though he flourished during the first half of the 4th century, and was therefore older than Praxiteles, it is customary to treat of him later because he seems to us to represent a wider departure from the Phaedian type and a nearer approach to Hellenistic art. Like Praxiteles, he wrought in marble. The only originals that we can in all probability assign to him are 2 badly mutilated heads from a temple in Tegea, which he is known to have constructed. In contrast with the quiet musing of the Praxitelian statue, that of Scopas is all feeling, passion, expressed primarily by the face, and in a less degree by the attitude of the body. The eye is sunken deeply beneath the brow and the surrounding flesh. From this shadow it gazes fixedly on a definite object. The nostrils are dilated, and the mouth, partly open, seems to indicate panting. The body is tense. The whole person is wrought up to a high pitch of anger, fear, or other passion. These qualities are all discoverable in his Meleager through the extant Roman copies. Though a Parian, Scopas lived for a time at Athens, and we can discover his spirit in the contemporary youths of Athenian grave reliefs, not only in the shadowy eyes but also in the intensity of the general expression. Lysippus. A further advance was made in the latter half of the same century by Lysippus of Sicyon, who is said to have wrought 1,500 statues, all in bronze. He is best represented by an excellent copy of his Apoxyomenos. It is an athlete engaged in scraping the oil and sand from his body after a contest in wrestling, and from this circumstance the statue has derived its name. Although the copy is in marble, it well expresses all the admirable qualities of the original bronze. We notice in the first place its wide departure from the Polycleton canon in the proportions of the body. The work of Lysippus has a smaller head and is taller and slimmer. Another noteworthy fact is that whereas the Dorophorus of Polycletus is to be seen from the front only, and hence is comparatively flat with the sides nearly at right angles, the work of Lysippus is to be seen from every direction and is therefore round. In brief, the artist has made an advance from the surface effect of the earlier masters to the effect of roundness and depth. We discover in the earlier work an impression of monumental repose and of collective massive strength. In the latter, that of restless, abundant vitality, intense energy, and high development of every power. From what has been said, it is clear that the study of Lysippus should proceed from a consideration of Polycletus. He has points of contact also with Praxiteles and Scopas, for his happy spirit recalls the former, his intensity the latter. In the creation of a buoyant joy, he is distinctly original. Portrait sculpture. In no department of art does the growing individualism display itself so clearly as in portrait sculpture. Before the age of Pericles, images even of the most famous men were wholly lacking in realism. Not Miltiades or Themistocles was so detached from his community as to call for an individual memorial of his achievements. The idea appeared but faintly in the Pericles by the artist Cressyllus. Yet this Herm represents the typical general and statesman far more than the particular person. During the generation that followed Pericles, however, the interest in eminent men so increased as to bring forth sculptured portraits of notable individuality. The head of Socrates shows his great intellectual power. The face of Euripides reveals deep spirituality. Throughout the 4th century, the tendency continued to grow. Sculptors who worked with success on a contemporary Plato or Aristotle essayed as well to reproduce the features of a man of the near past or of remote persons such as Homer and Sappho. In the latter case, the portraits were necessarily ideal. The statue of Sophocles in the Lateran Museum may be taken as an example of the idealization of a recent character. Shortly after his death, a statue, doubtless realistic, was erected by his son, and in this way the features of the great dramatist were perpetuated. The figure now under consideration, however, aimed to express the brilliance, the power, and the serene poise, rather than any physical peculiarities, of the tragedian. With the establishment of monarchy dawned a new era in portraiture, when Lysippus embodied in bronze the fiery spirit and the superhuman ambition of Alexander. Henceforth, the rulers of mankind were to have their features immortalized, not only in sculpture but on the face of coins, where hitherto the gods alone had enjoyed a place. From what has been said, it is evident that images of persons deserve treatment in a chapter on art. At the same time, a portrait, as a source for the study of character, connects itself most nearly with the activity of the person whom it represents. Appearance of the Corinthian capital. Meanwhile, architecture underwent great changes. The ornate Corinthian capital made its appearance. In a temple at Tegea, Scopas combined the three orders, making the peristyle Doric, the columns of the pronaos Corinthian, and those of the interior Ionic. He infused into the whole his own spirit of unrest. Another new feature of temple building was the high foundation, approached by many steps and designed to give the structure a commanding altitude. The element of magnificence, too, was promoted by a double peristyle as well as by greatly increased size. These were expensive innovations in keeping with the wealth of the Anatolian cities which constructed them. Noteworthy was the Didymaeum, a temple to Apollo at Miletus. It was 100 years in building, and not even then completed. Mausoleum at Halicarnassus. With the rise of monarchy reappeared gigantic tombs, unknown to Hellas since the Minoan age. Most remarkable was the mausoleum, tomb of Mausolus, satrap and king of Caria. It was situated at Halicarnassus, his capital, and was built and adorned by Greek architects and artists, about 350. The structure was nearly square, 440 feet in perimeter, and was 140 feet in height. On a foundation 42 feet high rested a building of the same altitude, surrounded by an Ionic peristyle. Above was a pyramidal roof, on the apex of which stood the colossal figures of the king and his queen Artemisia, beside a chariot and four. Among the sculptures which decorated the tomb is a mutilated frieze representing a battle between Greeks and Amazons. In contrast with the quiet dignity of earlier decorations, this frieze is amazingly bold and spirited in its flying draperies, tense attitudes, and furious movements. The desire for effect is no longer subject to the law of moderation, and Hellenism has begun to suffer from contact with foreign life. Part 2. Literature. New developments from the city-state. The central idea in Hellenism, the pivot on which everything Hellenic turns, was the city-state with all its traditional associations, religious, social, and civic. As the idea declined, there emerged from it two others, the individual and the human race, which were now in conflict, now in sympathy. During the period before us, the city-state continued, though weakening, whereas individualism and humanism were growing. These new developments affected every human activity, including war, politics, art, literature, and philosophy. From poetry to prose. In literature, the most obvious change was from poetry to prose. Poetry had devoted itself extensively to the state. The choral songs were chiefly for public occasions, and the drama appealed to the entire community. The decline of these forms of literature meant a changing relation between the individual and the state, a shifting of interest to private and social affairs, and from the emotional life perpetuated by tradition to the life of the reason, which is sufficient unto itself and an enemy of all control. Comedy. Of the lyric and tragic poetry composed in this period, almost nothing has survived. Comedy, poetic in form though prose in spirit, forsook politics for social life. This change of subject marks the transformation from Old to Middle comedy, 390 to 320, represented by two extant plays of Aristophanes, the Ecclesiazusai and the Plutus, whose contents have been noticed elsewhere. Along with the political spirit, comedy lost its fierce assaults upon prominent persons, its caricatures, gross indecencies, and the high flights of lyric genius. Growing tamer and more realistic, it attempted in quiet humor or good-natured satire to set forth the manners and morals of the age, to picture scenes and characters from actual life. Prose, its three great departments. In this century, as stated above, we have to do mainly with prose, which comprise three great departments: history, oratory, and philosophy. A noticeable feature is the narrow specialization of the authors, involving a strict separation of the fields. To us, it is surprising, for example, how little the orator or the philosopher knew of his country's past. Before Aristotle, authors were not learned men, but creative artists. The most liberal field was that of the historian, whose search for the truth made him akin to the scientist, while his rhetoric, soon to gain the mastery over the historical field, brought him into touch with the orator, and at the same time his study of motive and his analysis of government gave him points of contact with the ethical and political philosopher. The historian of broad vision, as heir to Herodotus, composed the Annals of Hellas, or of a great part of Hellas, for a definite period. By thus combining in treatment a multitude of city-states, he contributed to the mental preparation for a unified Hellenic nation. At the same time, the growing interest in prominent individuals produced biography. Thus it was that Isocrates, writing to King Nicocles of Cyprus, presented a eulogistic account of the achievements and character of Evagoras, father and predecessor of the person addressed. This is the first Hellenic biography known to us. Xenophon. Undoubtedly, this particular work, as well as the general development of individuality, greatly influenced the intellectual attitude of Xenophon, the 4th century historian with whom we have most to do. Xenophon, about 434 to 354, was born in a well-to-do family of pronounced conservative inclinations. From his social environment, he imbibed the sentiments that distinguished his rank, including a punctilious regard for the externals of religion, ethical reflection, refinement of feeling and speech, an interest in military training and in out-of-door sports, courage, a dislike of the multitude and fidelity to his class, in a word, Hellenic chivalry. His attachment to Socrates brought to fruitage the best that was in him, and in fact illuminated his entire life. His memoirs, Memorabilia, of Socrates, faithfully photographs the exterior of the great master and of his teachings, though it fails to penetrate to the depths. In fact, Xenophon is in everything superficial. This work and the Agesilaus illustrate his interest in individuals, though we find the same love of biography in all his historical writings. The Anabasis, already mentioned, is chiefly valuable for the insight it affords us into the composition and psychology of a mercenary army, drawn from many parts of Hellas and passing through various phases of success, adversity, peril, and deliverance. The Hellenica, his chief historical work, is a continuation of Thucydides from 411 to 362. The author, banished for treason from his native land, wrote under Lacedaemonian patronage. To his inborn shallowness, accordingly, he has added a partisanship for Sparta and an undue admiration for Agesilaus. Among the other works used extensively as sources in this volume are the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, the Economist, and the Ways and Means. The Cyropedia, Education of Cyrus, is a historical romance in which the author sets forth a model education of the child and youth, whence emerges the ideal man and sovereign. The preservation of this author's works is due to the interest of after ages in Socrates and to a wrong standard of judgment as to style and general worth. In mentioning his shortcomings, however, we should not lose sight of his positive merits. His interest in personal traits, which is totally wanting in Thucydides, but which marks Xenophon as a true child of his age, especially appeals to the modern student of Hellenic life and culture. He had traveled much, had acquired a wide knowledge of the world, and in his breadth of mind, his liberal education, and his ethical and religious principles, he represents the best features of the educated class of his generation. The Athedes, Aristotle, Constitution of the Athenians. Xenophon's literary style, subjecting itself to philosophic discipline, betrays almost no influence of the rhetoric which flourished in his day. Akin were the chronicles, whose interest lay in the collection and the systematizing of facts. Such chronicles of Athens were termed Athedes, plural of Athes. They began with the earliest mythical kings, and for the regal period they seem to have grouped events and institutions according to reigns. For the historical period they arranged the material analytically under the appropriate archons. Far from limiting himself to political and military happenings, the Athedographer included all kinds of institutional, personal, and cultural matter. The earliest of the class was Xenophon's contemporary, Cleidemus, whose Athes evidently was published after 378, but of whose work we have little information. Excepting a few brief fragments, all these Athedes have been lost. To us, the chronicler of greatest interest was Androtion, a prominent statesman of Athens, whose Athes appeared in 330. It was the chief source for Aristotle, Constitution of the Athenians, published a few years afterward. The latter work is one of a collection of 158 constitutional histories of states, mostly Hellenic, composed by Aristotle with the collaboration of his pupils. Each history consisted of 1. The narrative of constitutional growth to the philosopher's own time, 2. A contemporary survey of the Constitution. The treatise on the Athenian Constitution, the greater part of which was recovered in Egypt in 1890, is the only one we have of the vast collection. Growth and influence of rhetoric, orations of Lysias and Isaias. In order to take into account not simply the content but also the artistic form of literature, we must now give attention to the growth and influence of rhetoric. Since the origin of this branch of learning, oratory inevitably came more and more to be composed by set rule and principle. The extant orations of Lysias, however, belonging mainly to the first 2 decades of the 4th century, show a freshness, vigor, and independence unfettered by rhetorical bonds. Having taken his lessons of the rhetorician, the author preserves his own mastery of style. His oration is artistic, but he has concealed his art. In appearance, his language is that of everyday life. In fact, it is highly idealized. This orator is a model of simple narrative, of dramatic skill in adapting speech to the character of the speaker for whom he professionally writes, of ethos, the gentle current of feeling that wins the sympathy of the hearers. These qualities render his speeches most valuable, not only as pictures of common life, but as psychological views both of the individual litigants and of the multitudinous jury. A similar writer of speeches for others was Isaias, perhaps also a metic, whose extant productions range nearly through the first half of the century, 390 to 353. They have to do with family law, with cases of adoption and inheritance. In tone less winsome than Lysias, he is more argumentative and militant. On the whole, he clings to the simple Lysian style, while revealing the mere beginnings of the mature, powerful oratory of the Demosthenic age. The 12 speeches which we possess have the same value for Athenian life as those of Lysias. Isocrates and his work. It was in Isocrates of Athens that rhetoric came to full maturity. His life, 436 to 338, was contemporary with the whole development of prose literature, and with the culmination and incipient decay of the city-state. It was his achievement to mold the oration into a formal work of art, comparable to a Pindaric ode or to a piece of sculpture. With a delicate taste for literary form, he gave the most minute and prolonged attention to the elaboration of a nicely adjusted periodology, and to the exquisite choice and arrangement of words with a view to euphony and rhythm. These qualities are untranslatable. The style is too formal, the periods are too monotonous, for the conveyance of anything more than quiet thought and feeling. Although a few of his orations are judicial, the greater number are in fact essays, for reading rather than for delivery. In these works he set forth the theory and the content of the culture which he upheld, both in his writings and in the school of statesmanship which he conducted. The young man who went forth from his school was to possess a largeness of view which considered the interest, not of his native city alone, but of the entire Hellenic nation, a moral elevation above all self-seeking and ignoble passion, an efficiency of method acquired by long and careful preparation, and an ambition to achieve great and permanent results. As a product of this culture may be mentioned the Panegyricus, his masterpiece, on which he is said to have labored 10 years. Its advocacy of Hellenic union was noticed above. While expressing sentiments that might be interpreted as cosmopolitan, his leading political principle of Hellas against Persia shows him at heart a genuine Greek, an exponent of nationalism rather than of humanism. In home politics, he was a conservative who preferred the constitution of Solonian and Cleisthenian times, when the council of the Areopagus kept parental ward over citizens and magistrates, when offices were unpaid and filled by election. These views he set forth in his Areopagiticus. It need hardly be said that reform by such reaction is never wise nor practicable, whereas the writings of this eminent publicist, distributed through so long a career and touching Hellenic life on many sides, are valuable to us for the facts they convey and for their interpretation of Greek conditions and character. There can hardly be a doubt that he molded public opinion and directed the general current of intelligence chiefly through his school. In a 3 or 4 year course, he trained his pupils in oratory and supplied them with the information essential to public careers. They came from all parts of Hellas, from regions as distant as the Black Sea, Cyprus, and Sicily, highly endowed youths from prominent families. Having completed this education, a goodly number became philosophers, rhetoricians, and historians, generals, statesmen, and even kings. Through these men, the culture of Isocrates influenced all the higher walks of life throughout the length and breadth of Hellas. Ephorus. By 2 of these pupils, Ephorus of Cumae, Iolus, and Theopompus of Chios, both born about 380, the stream of rhetoric was conducted upon the historical field. The principal work of Ephorus was a universal history in 30 books, from the return of the Heraclidae, Dorian invasion, to the siege of Perinthus, 340, when the narrative was cut short, probably by death. Although it has been lost with the exception of a few fragments, the work is of great interest to us as the chief source on that period for Diodorus and for the historical parts of Strabo the geographer. The author laid claim to critical discrimination and aimed to gain a personal knowledge of the geography and topography of the events narrated, but in fact he has often marred his pages with bias or puerility in the treatment of motive, with exaggerations of numbers in military affairs and similar defects. His rhetorical style ran in a smooth but languid current, agreeable to the ear, though monotonous. Theopompus. Theopompus, his schoolmate, was like his master, a writer of speeches on matters of public interest. In the historical field, he composed a Hellenica in 12 books, which continued the work of Thucydides, and a Philippica in 58 books, a detailed history of his own time. In contrast with Ephorus, he was forceful and passionate and in style more oratorical. The extant fragments, preserved especially in Athenaeus, show a noteworthy interest in society, culture, and character, with a disproportionate love of exhibiting the luxuries and the vices of mankind. In spite of the shortcomings of Ephorus and Theopompus, the finding of the works of either author, especially of the latter, would doubtless greatly enlarge our knowledge of Greek history and civilization. This loss has been brought home to us by the discovery of the fragment of a history known as the Oxyrhynchus Hellenica from the place of finding. It gives a detailed account of the events of 396 and includes a surprisingly interesting digression on the Boeotian federal constitution. Although we have not the means of determining the author, we cannot doubt that the work was distinctly superior to Xenophon's Hellenica. It is composed in a smooth flowing style that reveals the influence of Isocrates, and in this respect it might belong to either Theopompus or Ephorus. Rhetoric dominates the historical field. From the beginnings here described, rhetoric with its attendant ethics soon came to dominate the historical field. It became the function of the historian to contribute through his works to the oratorical and ethical education, particularly of those who wished to enter public life. The form became more important than the content, the moral end more valued than the ascertainment of truth. This was one of various ways in which the ancients, less inclined than moderns to the study of facts, through the lapse of centuries loosened their hold upon reality and slowly degenerated into medievalism. Aeschines and Demosthenes. Whereas the professional speechwriter multiplied and distributed his works as examples of his art, the publicist spread his pamphlets abroad for the propagation of his ideas. Meanwhile, a political event acting upon the internal development of literature brought the oratory of Athens to a height of perfection never again attained to the present day, and forced the statesman to disseminate his views through published orations. This event was the growth of the Macedonian power, which throughout eastern Hellas divided public men into two parties, Macedonian and anti-Macedonian, who respectively favored and opposed Philip and Alexander. The relative merits of the two policies need not be considered here. In Athens, as above indicated, the most conspicuous upholder of Philip was Aeschines, the most brilliant opponent Demosthenes. The latter received the especial support of Hyperides and Lycurgus, speakers of high rank and able in the administration of public affairs. The orator of this period, combining his predecessor's resources, employed them with a mastery unknown to earlier time. Advancing beyond Lysias, he boldly revealed his art. To the winsome ethos of that orator, and to the argumentative skill of Isaias, he added on occasions a vehemence that overwhelmed his hearers. In brief, he had learned not only to appeal to reason, but to play upon all the keys of human emotion. It is needless here to characterize the styles of individual orators, for all excellences were united and brought to perfection in Demosthenes, the master, not of one but of every style. The son of a well-to-do manufacturer, he was left fatherless in childhood and cheated of his inheritance by perfidious guardians. As he was physically weak, his mother, keeping him by her side, deprived him of the usual gymnastic training. Thus he grew up in poor health, unsocial, seemingly lacking fitness for active life, and cherishing the one desire for vengeance on those who had wronged him. He qualified himself for oratory that he might prosecute his guardians, and success in this undertaking gave him a reputation as a speechwriter, the foundation of a substantial fortune. Meanwhile, when inspiration came to him to serve his country as a statesman, strength of will surmounted every obstacle. A defective articulation he made good by prolonged training. He steeped his mind in Thucydides, whence chiefly he drew his knowledge of the past and his militant ideal of the state. From Isaias and Isocrates and many others, he learned useful lessons. For delivery, he took training under a successful actor. Behind this external equipment, all necessary in itself, we discover a literary genius unsurpassed, and a burning patriotism combined with the religious zeal of a prophet, the practical statesman who in the sweep of his eloquence never fails to point out the concrete way to success, the moral idealist who by constant appeals to the nobler feelings of his hearers gradually lifts them to a higher ethical level, the champion of local freedom against encroaching despotism, of a high culture against the advance of an inferior civilization. The universalization of Hellenism was not a conscious issue. If Demosthenes opposed the events that contributed to this process, at least he enriched Hellenism by his supreme oratory, and still more by his defense of human freedom, the greatest gift of Hellas to mankind. Part 3. Philosophy. Plato. Plato, the great creative philosopher of the age, was born at Athens in 427 of highly aristocratic parents. A kinsman was Critias, the violent leader of the 30. On the overthrow of this oligarchy, the young man thought of entering public life, but the condemnation of Socrates, his revered master, awakened in him an undying hatred of democracy. He could do nothing, therefore, but remain in private life and satisfy his political longings with the creation of ideal constitutions or appeal to a tyrant for the realization of his vision of the perfect state. It was probably in the year 387 that Plato opened in his private house a school called the Academy from its nearness to the public garden of that name. The School of Plato. His literary works are dialogues. We know, however, that he considered these writings a popular presentation of such views as, in his opinion, the laity could understand. In his school, he lectured more learnedly on mathematics, astronomy, harmonics, and ethics. In this work, he rightly leaned upon the Pythagoreans, while giving his pupils a fruitful impetus to further mathematical and physical researches. While holding to the end that the earth is the center of the universe, he finally accepted the doctrine of the earth's rotation on its axis. Following his suggestion, a Pythagorean friend, Eudoxus, attempted to explain the seemingly irregular movements of sun, moon, and planets by a theory of homocentric hollow spheres revolving around the earth at different velocities. The heavenly bodies, he assumes, are fastened to these spheres. To the sun and moon he assigns 3 spheres each, to the 5 known planets 4 spheres each, whereas a single sphere suffices for all the fixed stars. Although these spheres are a pure fiction, mathematically they serve their purpose and are therefore a highly ingenious theory. The Dialogues of Plato. Of the lectures of Plato, however, we have mere hints. It is upon the dialogues, in addition to the little that can be gathered from his pupil Aristotle, that we must chiefly rely for our knowledge of his views. The dialogue, which had long been a favorite instrument of the philosopher, received from Plato an artistic form. It shows him not a dry reasoner, but a highly imaginative poet. Though prose in form, his language, brilliantly versatile, sparkles with poetic gems. He is gifted, too, with rare dramatic power. The speakers of the dialogues are living persons who everywhere retain their psychological identity. We should not look to his writings for a consistent system of knowledge, for through an active life of 81 years his mind continually developed. During this time he came into contact or renewed his acquaintance with existing philosophies, one after another, from each of which he received an enlargement of his mental horizon and a new impetus to creative work. At the basis of his thought lies his doctrine of ideas. Socrates had taught him that the only objects of knowledge are concepts, universal truths established by induction. With Plato, the concept becomes an idea, a word derived from the Pythagoreans and signifying form. Ideas are not forms in the geometrical sense, but are colorless, shapeless, intangible realities, which the mind alone can perceive. In distinction from our ideas, which have their being in the mind alone, those of Plato are objective realities, in fact, the only things that exist. The objects of sense are real insofar only as they partake of these pure realities. Plato's Ethics. Plato's chief concern was with ethics. The greatest of all ideas, he taught, is God, who created the world and gave to it a soul. through which reason and order and life came into all things. At his command, the lesser gods fashioned the body of man, and he himself prepared the soul, making it of the same substance as the world's soul, though less pure. Each human soul is given a star to which it will return after having completed a good life on earth. But the soul that has lived badly will at the next birth enter an inferior creature. This theory of creation and of human life is presented not as a dogma, but as a mere approximation of the truth, a metaphor continually varied throughout his writings. By means of education, man advances toward the highest good, which is neither knowledge nor happiness, but the utmost likeness to God. Happiness, altogether different from bodily pleasure, is the possession of the good. In Plato's doctrine, taken from the Orphists, the body is merely the dungeon or the tomb of the soul. From the body, the soul must purify itself in order to attain to the good and to virtue, which is the fitness of the soul for its proper work. Plato's Republic. An important division of ethics is politics. In the view of Plato, the state is not the all-in-all of the citizen as it had been in former time. The calm existence of the philosopher, the solving of the problems of the essential and the eternal, is a nobler being than that of the politician. The body only of the philosopher lives in the state, while his soul dwells elsewhere untouched by political ambition. This is true of a community like Athens, he asserts, governed by the ignorant majority, whose greatest statesmen, Pericles, Cimon, Miltiades, and Themistocles, utterly have failed in the function of improving the character of the citizens. It would be quite otherwise with a state philosophically organized, like that set forth in his Republic. As any state is an individual writ large, the ideal state is constituted like a perfect individual with the baser parts subordinate to the nobler. In this ideal community, there are to be three social classes: the laborers, the soldiers, and the rulers, the last two constituting the guardians. These elements are borrowed from the actual Hellenic world. Evidently, the laborers on the farm and in the trades are helots and perioeci. The soldiers are the Spartan warriors, whereas the philosophic rulers look to the Pythagoreans as their prototype. The lowest class is intellectually least endowed, and fit for nothing but manual labor. Their virtue, like that of the soul's lowest faculty, is obedience to the higher powers. The middle class are the warriors, whose virtue is courage. They ply no manual work, but devote their lives to their special function. It is upon them and the ruling class that Plato bestows his chief attention. These gradations, however, are not castes, but each is formed by a careful selection from the class just below, so that men are constantly rising from the lower to the higher grades of society. Praiseworthy are the assignment of rank according to capacity, the division of labor which makes for efficiency, and the abolition of slavery. The education of guardians is to begin at birth. All who have infants in charge are to see that every act performed and every word spoken in the child's presence shall be such as will contribute to the right growth of character. From 7 to 17, he pursues elementary studies, reading, writing, the lower mathematics, gymnastics, and music, including literature. Most of the poets, along with Homer, are rejected because they suggest immoral or irreligious views. Nothing but the strengthening and the ennobling is acceptable. From 17 to 20, the youth has his preliminary training in arms. At this period, it is determined who are to be warriors, and who are to continue the intellectual education essential to statesmen. From 20 to 30, the latter class are to devote themselves to the thorough study of the sciences. If incapable of advancing farther, they enter public life as minor officials, whereas the few who are better gifted devote 5 additional years to the study of ideas. From 35 to 50, these intellectuals govern the state, after which they retire to a life of higher philosophic thought. In planning for an advanced intellectual education carefully regulated, Plato made one of his greatest contributions to civilization. That the guardians, both warriors and statesmen, may devote themselves unselfishly and untrammeled to their functions, individual wealth and the family itself are abolished. Property is held in common, and the mating of men and women is managed by the state with an eye single to the birth of strong, healthful children. Eugenics is pushed to extremes. Women, relieved of the care of children, are to have the same training as men and to perform the same military and political services. Even if such a state were capable of realization, it is too unnatural a thing to bring good results. From the first, Plato saw that no community would voluntarily adopt it, and in his old age substituted a more workable political system in one of his latest writings, the Laws. The chief value of the Republic lies in its individual suggestions as to educational, social, and political reforms, and in the powerful impetus it gives to the intellectual life of the reader. In brief, it is not the knowledge discovered by Plato, but his belief in spiritual realities, his aspiration to the beautiful, the good, and the true, his conception of the vast heights attainable by man, that place him among the most powerful intellectual and moral forces that operate upon the human race. Aristotle, the pupil of Plato. After the death of its founder, the academy continued under other masters and gradually degenerated. Meanwhile, the creative and organizing activities within the philosophic field were carried on with greater success by others. The real heir to Plato was his most brilliant pupil, Aristotle, 384 to 322, from Stagirus Chalcidice. 20 years he studied under Plato. 3 years, 343 to 40, he was a teacher of Alexander, the young Macedonian prince. Still later, he returned to Athens and established a school of his own named the Lyceum, after the famous gymnasium in which he taught. His system of thought is also described as peripatetic, from the circumstance that he walked, peripatein, with his pupils while giving instruction. Aristotle's dialogues. His dialogues, which were popular like those of Plato, have been lost, but most of his technical works, corresponding to Plato's lectures, are extant. Among them, however, are studies either finished or wholly composed by his pupils, which we cannot, with certainty in every case, distinguish from writings exclusively his own. Aristotle the Scholar. In Aristotle we discover a new type of mind, that of the scholar as distinguished from the essentially creative intelligence. It is true that he was himself a discoverer, but his great achievement was to systematize and reduce to writing the knowledge which the Hellenes had thus far accumulated. Accepting in the main the method and system of Plato, he made corrections in detail, and with his more logical mind and a greater command of facts, he was able to render the method more precise and to widen the field of scientific thought. In this task, he discovered that the most insignificant fact of nature is worthy of attention as the potential source of valuable knowledge. In general, he was less concerned with abstract reasoning than Plato, and more with observation and experience. The work of scientific experimentation, however, was then in its infancy, and the observer was hampered by a lack of instruments. The remarkable thing is that with his limitations, he was able to accomplish so much. Divisions of knowledge. The main divisions of knowledge in his classification are logic, metaphysics, natural history, and ethics. Under the head of metaphysics, he places his first philosophy, universal principles on which everything else is based. Natural history includes physics and astronomy, as well as psychology and physiology, zoology, botany, and other studies of nature. Rhetoric and politics are branches of ethics. A fifth department of knowledge may be described as a philosophy of art, represented by his poetics. Mathematics he did not cultivate as an independent study. In logic, he completed a system of proof begun by Socrates. From particulars, he rises to universals by induction, as the earlier philosopher taught. From principles, he reasons back to particulars by the process of deduction through the syllogism, a formula of reasoning first clearly set forth by himself. Nature study. Despite his considerable study of nature, the least valuable parts of his system are those which depend upon observation rather than upon abstract thought. This fact is illustrated by his astronomy, a system of the universe cruder perhaps than that of Eudoxus described above. The collection of material for his study of plants and animals was probably facilitated by Alexander, though we are certain that no systematic gathering accompanied the marches of the conqueror. That Aristotle made many mistakes in describing animals he had never seen was inevitable, and we need not be surprised to find him in error as to the functions of some of the most vital organs. Flesh, he supposed, is the medium of sensation. Chief of all organs is the heart, which prepares the blood and aids in motion and sensation. The blood, purified by the heart, flows from thence to the various parts of the body, whereas the brain serves to cool the blood and moderate the heat arising from the heart. The study of plants begun by him was carried farther and ultimately published by Theophrastus, his successor. Most interesting is Aristotle's theory as to progress made by the creative power of nature. Beginning with the lowest forms of life, she gradually passes to the higher. Having fashioned the plants, she proceeds to the invention of animals, and thence to men. This process is an evolution, not of organic nature itself, but of the creative power. The ethics of Aristotle. Whereas Plato gives inspiration, Aristotle conveys knowledge. The one soars above the clouds, the other keeps his feet firmly on earth. In his Ethics, as elsewhere, Aristotle appeals more strongly to the average man. Casting aside the dictum of Socrates and Plato, that knowledge is virtue, he recognizes that a man may know the right but have too weak a will to do it. Useful are only those thoughts that lead to useful actions, and happiness, the supreme good, is nothing more than good and efficient life regulated by right rules of conduct. It is the function of ethics to supply these rules. Pleasures which involve mere self-indulgence are wholly bad. Others, arising from the normal exercise of any faculty, though not ends in themselves, are desirable. Although well-being, including health, wealth, friends, and family, are helpful to the cultivation of virtue, they are not essential, and a philosopher may draw strength from illness and poverty. The Politics of Aristotle. No man liveth unto himself is one of the strongest tenets of this philosopher. Personal affections within and outside the family and kin constitute friendship. True friendship, involving a love of the good qualities discoverable in the friend and an unselfish desire to benefit, is one of the most powerful moral forces in society. A broadening of friendship brings us to the common life of the community. Man is a political animal, and his highest existence is in the state. The aim of the state is not simply the protection of the life and property of the citizens, but their education to the highest reach of moral and spiritual fitness. In the Politics, the author does not seek the ideal state. His aim rather is to determine the nature of the state in all the varieties furnished by the Hellenic world, to discover the constitution best adapted to every typical community, to ascertain defects of various political systems and remedies for them. His task, in brief, is to create a political science on the basis of induction from actual conditions furnished by a multitude of city-states, chiefly Hellenic, but including a few foreign cities like Carthage. As the Politics is extensively quoted in another chapter, it requires no lengthy treatment here. Despite incompleteness and an imperfect text, it is the greatest contribution to political and social science made by the ancient world. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27. Alexander's Empire and the Hellenistic Kingdoms, 337 to 146. Death of Philip. The invasion of Asia Minor followed hard upon the accession of the Hellenic deputies at Corinth. In the early months of 336, Philip's best general Parmenion crossed the Hellespont with a Macedonian army to guard the strait against the king's coming. While the latter lingered to divide his time between state business and carousals, throughout his life he had recklessly courted danger in violent debaucheries and hazardous marital ventures. A polygamous barbarian, he took no wives with him to war but married new brides in the course of every campaign, women of various nationalities who enmeshed the conqueror in the web of their acrimonious intrigues. It was at least suspected that Olympias, mother of Alexander, when repudiated in favour of another woman, instigated the assassin against her husband. At all events, he was murdered in the midst of a festival. Philip had achieved the task of making his own state the greatest military power in the world, and of giving to Eastern Hellas at least the form of institutional unity. The conquest of Asia was left to his no less competent son, Alexander. Alexander was but 20 when he mounted the throne. He had had Aristotle as an instructor, to whom we naturally credit the young man's interest in the enlargement of science, and had won military distinction under his father. His inspiration he had drawn from the Iliad. His ideal was Achilles, a young man of tempestuous passions and a brave, indomitable warrior. In brief, Alexander's nature combined the romantic with the practical. Immediately the weakness of his father's Hellenic arrangements revealed itself in widespread disaffection. It was not till Alexander took Thebes by assault, destroyed the city, and sold the inhabitants into slavery that the Greeks could be made to understand that they still had a master. He continued Philip's policy in relation to them. The Hellenic League and his own captaincy were maintained, although his military demand upon the Greeks was appreciably lighter than his father had planned. Alexander's conquests. In the spring of 334, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with about 35,000 men. On the Granicus River he met a slightly larger force of the enemy, the infantry consisting of Greek mercenaries. His victory was speedy and complete. After this success he proceeded to liberate the Hellenic cities and to settle their affairs in the manner to be described below. How far the intentions of Alexander reached on the day when he crossed the Hellespont we do not know. Probably not to the conquest of the whole Persian Empire, but the young man of fiery spirit and growing ambition could never content himself with present achievements, however great. From the acquisition of the Aegean coast he was led to the conquest of Asia Minor. It was a keen disappointment that a majority of the Hellenes, far from regarding him as a deliverer, threw their sympathy to the Persian side, and lacking the support of their warships while those of the enemy commanded the sea, he had to make his advance along the coast in order to occupy the port towns and thus secure himself from attack by water. At Issus, Cilicia, he met King Darius in command of an army much larger than his own. The battle, however, was fought in a narrow plain hemmed in by forests, so that the Persian king could not take advantage of his superior numbers. His army was routed and dispersed, and he could only save himself by headlong flight. From this time it is clear that Alexander, with enlarged ambition, intended to conquer the Persian Empire. Having thus determined, Alexander first took possession of the Syrian coast and of Egypt. For a while, marching into the interior, he dared not leave in his rear a single port open to the hostile fleet. This campaign involved the capture of Tyre and of Gaza by siege. Egypt yielded without resistance and welcomed the conqueror, who interested himself in the worship of its gods. Founding of Alexandria. The young man's quick intelligence discovered on the coast of Egypt the best site for a colony, which he named Alexandria. As Tyre lay in ruins, his new city was to be the great port of the nearer Orient, to provide a commercial bond between his eastern domains and the kingdom of his fathers. Another object of the settlement, composed of Macedonians and Greeks with but subsidiary native elements, was to secure the fidelity of Egypt. Alexander, the son of Zeus. For millennia, the Egyptians had been accustomed to absolute rule. Their pharaoh was a god-king, the incarnation of a deity. In accepting Alexander as their pharaoh, they could only think of him as a divine incarnation. Their view, however, had no effect on Hellenic thought. But in the Libyan desert between Egypt and Cyrene lay the oracle of Ammon, whom the Hellenes identified with Zeus, and to whom they had been accustomed to resort for prophecies more weighty even than those of the Delphic Apollo. Thither went Alexander, and received from the oracle of the desert acknowledgment that he was the son of Zeus. The young king, who had fed his mind on Homeric myths and had already achieved the superhuman in battle and conquest, probably believed the story. Certainly the theory of his own divinity grew on him from that time forth. Battle of Arbela. After Alexander had settled the affairs of Egypt and Syria, he marched slowly eastward, crossed the Euphrates and Tigris, and with 47,000 men met Darius near Arbela in command of an army which the ancients estimate in numbers ranging from 250,000 to 4,000,000 horse and foot. We may assume at least that the king's forces materially outnumbered Alexander's. On this occasion Darius had chosen an open plain where his superiority in bulk could be made effective. He hoped with his elephants and his scythed chariots to break the phalanx, after which his cavalry, supported by footmen, would complete the Macedonian rout. The phalangites, however, opened their ranks to let the chariots pass through, or dislodge the drivers and turn the teams back upon the enemy. Alexander was outflanked, but seeing a gap in the enemy's line, he dashed in at the head of a cavalry brigade and cut the army of Darius in two. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx, advancing in touch with the Persians, drove them to flight. There were many complications which need not be described here. It is enough to say that the critical victory of the war was due to the skill of Alexander and his officers and the bravery and discipline of his men. Darius fled and was ultimately murdered by his own subjects. Further conquests. The Battle of Arbela gave the victor a vital hold upon the empire, but left to his remaining campaigns the none too easy task of overcoming widely separated points of resistance. Babylon surrendered without delay. He entered the city and worshipped its gods, as he had worshipped those of Egypt. From Babylon he marched with little opposition into Persia, and occupied its two capitals, Susa and Persepolis. In the treasuries of both places he found great hoards of silver, which he confiscated and put into circulation. The palace at Persepolis he destroyed with fire, and the inhabitants he slaughtered, to punish the Persians for having burnt the cities and temples of Hellas, and to ruin their prestige as an imperial people. Down to this time, as this deed indicates, he remained a champion of Hellenism. Policy of solidifying the empire. 3 years were occupied in reducing the northeastern provinces of the empire, where the powerful satraps at the head of the warlike inhabitants offered him an obstinate resistance. During these campaigns, Alexander began to adopt the Persian royal dress and habits, at first when giving audience to natives, and afterwards on all occasions. It was in line with his policy of assimilating Macedonians and Greeks with a view to solidifying his empire. To this end, he encouraged the marriage of his soldiers with native women. At his command, 30,000 youths of the country were chosen to receive instruction in the Greek language and to be trained in the use of Macedonian arms. At the same time, the king began to show irritability at opposition or lack of deference in his subjects. Civility was spreading among the Macedonians, but the more manly spirits resented his Persian airs and his increasing aloofness, and conspiracy was formed. Philotas, son of his best general Parmenion, though cognizant of the plot, neglected to inform Alexander. When the truth finally reached the ears of the king, he brought Philotas on a charge of treason before an assembly of Macedonians, who lost no time in condemning the accused to death. Under torture, Philotas had mentioned his father, who too was put to death, though doubtless innocent. Parmenion was the ablest general of the school of Philip, and Alexander's most faithful lieutenant. His son was probably guilty of nothing worse than neglect. There was murmuring throughout the army at the murder of Parmenion, but no one dared remonstrate. Shortly after, during a festival to Dionysus, when the company was drinking heavily, the courtiers began to flatter Alexander, comparing him with Heracles, and saying that he surpassed his father in achievements. Cleitus, a young Macedonian noble, rashly protesting against this flattery, extolled Philip and depreciated Alexander, boasting that he, Cleitus, had saved the king's life in battle. In great rage, Alexander seized a weapon and killed him, but afterward was exceedingly sorry for what he had done. Oriental absolutism of Alexander. His next step towards Oriental absolutism was the requirement that all who approached should prostrate themselves before him. To the natives, the act meant nothing more than ceremonial respect, whereas the Europeans regarded it as worship. It was agreed between him and certain of his companions that at a prospective banquet they should themselves set the example. On this occasion, Callisthenes, the philosopher and historian, by refusing to prostrate himself, incurred the king's anger. For the time being, Callisthenes went unharmed, but not long afterward was implicated in a conspiracy of the pages. These were the sons of Macedonian nobles, brought up in the king's court and acting as his personal guard. Alexander's insolence towards one of their number incited among them a plot to kill him while he slept. It was discovered, and the ringleader and Callisthenes, who was suspected of instigating the conspiracy, were put to death. Alexander's campaigns in the northeastern satrapies completed the subjugation of the empire. Along the lines of his marches, he had distributed colonies and had given attention to organization, obviously insufficient, for every successful campaign whetted his appetite for conquest and in him lived the spirit of the explorer. India was a land of wonders, which no Hellenic traveller had described, which Heracles and Dionysus alone had traversed. Alexander could not admit an inferiority to these divine beings, or neglect the opportunity to add this marvellous region to his empire. Thus it was that romantic rather than practical considerations led him into India. Alexander in India. He met with no strong opposition. The country was divided among a multitude of independent kings, some of whom became his allies. But the army experienced unspeakable sufferings from the intense heat and the downpour of rain, lasting through many days. Alexander wished to go farther. Thoughts of universal dominion are ascribed to him by Arrian, but the military harangue put in his mouth is evidently a fiction, and through the myths that envelop him, we cannot penetrate to his true desires. Whatever they may have been, they were checked by the refusal of his troops to go farther. As the omens proved unfavourable to an advance, Alexander acceded to their wishes and began the homeward journey. They passed down the Indus, at whose mouth he and his men first became acquainted with the tides. Having organized the conquered part of India in 3 satrapies and left colonies of veterans, he began his return march through the Gedrosian desert. This way was chosen from love of exploration and the desire to surpass Semiramis and Cyrus, who, as the king heard, had vainly attempted a march through this dangerous waste. Again his soldiers suffered horribly, and many succumbed to heat and thirst and the fatigue of marching through the deep sand. In 60 days, however, the task was achieved by the survivors, and Alexander, emerging from the desert with the shattered remnant of his army, reached Carmania in the autumn of 325. Meanwhile, his admiral, Nearchus of Crete, sailing from the mouth of the Indus, skirted the coast of the Arabian and Persian Gulfs. His careful survey was of great value for the promotion of maritime commerce with the Far East, while his observations of nature and man along the voyage contributed to the progress of science. Along considerable stretches of coast, the inhabitants were savages, ignorant of iron, but making use of stone implements and of their fingernails, which grew long and formidable like the claws of animals. They dressed scantily in the skins of beasts or of fish. They baked bread of meal made from dried fish, and it is seriously asserted that their sheep lived on fish. Death of Alexander. On his return from the east, Alexander took up his residence at Babylon. With him there could be no thought of rest. The empire had to be rescued from the misrule brought into it by his officers during the long campaigns in Bactria and India, and a prodigious naval armament had to be fitted out for his next enterprise, the conquest of Arabia and the colonization of the region bordering the Persian Gulf. Urged on by his restless energy, these preparations were under rapid way. Meanwhile, Alexander was ruining his constitution by drinking to excess and wasting his strength in all-night revels. In this condition, he was unable to throw off the germs of fever which he had contracted. He died accordingly in his 33rd year. Although his lifetime was brief, no other man had ever achieved anything to compare with his labours, either in conquest or in organization. We must grant that his success was largely due to the excellent army laboriously created by his father, to the able generals trained in Philip's school, and to the internal weakness of the Persian Empire. At the same time, great credit must be given to the quickness and accuracy of the young king's observation and thought, and to the daring rapidity of his movements. For statesmanship, he was too romantic and egoistic. And although he remains the most dazzling figure in military annals, it cannot be soberly stated that the world lost through his premature death. During Alexander's careers of conquest, the states of the Greek homeland continued restive. His agents and officers frequently violated the compact made between him and the Hellenic League. Tyrants had been established in certain Greek cities, and Macedonians had preyed upon Hellenic commerce. Sparta headed a Peloponnesian revolt, but it had failed and she was compelled to submit. With the evident design of subverting the liberties of the Hellenes guaranteed by his father, Alexander let it be known that he wished them to consider him a god, and shortly afterward ordered all Greek states to receive back their political exiles. Although in itself humane, this move in behalf of the banished was a flagrant violation of the federal constitution established by Philip, an unmistakable evidence of the king's despotic intentions. Demosthenes find. In Athens, materialistic considerations, but slightly outweighing patriotism, barely sufficed to keep the peace. On several occasions Demosthenes, made cautious by long experience, effectually opposed a break with Alexander. A special opportunity for war was offered the Athenians when Harpalus, chief treasurer of Alexander, embezzling the royal funds, escaped to Greece. On this occasion, Demosthenes dissuaded the Athenians from war, but was himself prosecuted, along with others, on a charge of having accepted a bribe from Harpalus. Condemned to a fine of 50 talents and unable to pay, he was cast into prison, whence he escaped and went into exile. The facts on which to base a judgment as to his guilt or innocence are wanting, but at least it is clear that the court which condemned him was influenced more by political considerations than by evidence. Revolt of the states of Greece. When word of Alexander's death reached Greece, it found the states ready for the revolt. They were dissatisfied with the Macedonian supremacy and their love of independence was still strong. Nearly all the states of the peninsula united in a league for revolt, the most prominent being the Athenians and the Aetolians. Demosthenes employed his eloquence in the creation of the league and was now returned to Athens. Leosthenes, an Athenian general of experience and ability, held chief command. He defeated Antipater, governor of Macedon, and besieged him in the fortress of Lamia. From this circumstance the conflict is known as the Lamian War. Unfortunately, Leosthenes was killed. The enemy received heavy reinforcements from Asia, and the Hellenic cause failed. Chosen to pronounce the funeral oration over the Athenians who fell early in the war, Hyperides, while praying a graceful tribute to the dead, upheld in evil days with a spirit worthy of his ancestors the Hellenic ideals of patriotism, freedom, and human dignity. The coalition dissolved and the states made separate terms with Antipater. Athens had to receive a Macedonian garrison in Munichia to limit her franchise to the 9,000 wealthiest, those who possessed property worth at least 2,000 drachmas, and to give up for punishment the chief instigators of the revolt. Among the victims were Hyperides and Demosthenes. The former was captured and slain. The latter took poison to avoid seizure. An epigram of the period summarizes well the aspiration and the failure of the last great Hellenic orator. Orator, mighty in spirit, if only thy strength had been equal, Ares of Macedon god, ne'er would have ruled over Greece. In this war, the highest civilization succumbed to the lower. A people of refined thought, speech, and emotion yielded to men of blood and iron. Perdiccas, regent of the empire. Meanwhile, at Babylon, for the time being the center of the empire, events were occurring contrary to the intentions which Alexander, while living, had cherished. As he died without an heir, the Macedonian army in that city determined to recognize as king Alexander's feeble-minded half-brother Arihaedeus, and only reluctantly consented that the great conqueror's son, Alexander, born of Roxana after the father's death, should be associated with Arihaedeus on the throne. So prejudiced were the Macedonians against all connection with Asiatics. Perdiccas, a general under Alexander, became regent of the empire. There were insurrections to put down, in addition to that in Hellas, and still unconquered parts of the empire to subjugate. This work was accomplished, but meantime the two kings were murdered before either could attain to authority, and the machinations of Alexander's great generals, their rivalries and coalitions, began to threaten the unity of the empire. Their political maneuvers and civil wars for the next 2 decades and more, 323 to 301. In this period, Antigonus, perhaps the ablest and most energetic general surviving the conqueror, strove to maintain the integrity of the empire under his own monarchy. The other generals, however, combined against him. In the Battle of Ipsus, Phrygia, 301, they completely overpowered him, and he acknowledged by suicide the failure of his ambition. Division of Alexander's empire. Abandoning all idea of unity, the victors proceeded to carve the empire into kingdoms for themselves. Ptolemy retained Egypt, of which he had long been governor, and in addition Coel Syria. Seleucus held most of the empire east of Mount Taurus, with Greater Phrygia in Asia Minor. Cassander, son of Antipater, retained Macedon and a claim to the headship of Greece. The realm of Lysimachus comprised Thrace and the greater part of Asia Minor. Ultimately, his kingdom was dissolved, whereupon the sway of Seleucus extended to the Aegean Sea. In this manner, the empire of Alexander came to be divided into 3 great powers, Macedon, Egypt, and the kingdom of the Seleucidae, and thus it remained till the intrusion of Rome in the east. Agathocles. The ruling class in these monarchies were European, Greeks, and Hellenized Macedonians. Over the Orientals they had little difficulty in maintaining the supremacy of their civilization. In other parts of the Hellenic world the problem was more difficult. In the region north of the Black Sea, the natives so encroached upon the territory of the Greeks that the latter no longer had wheat for continual exportation, but often had to import it for their own use from the Aegean region. In Sicily and southern Italy, the maintenance of Hellenic freedom had become even more critical. After the death of Timoleon, 337, Syracuse was again distracted by factional strife, and Sicily was again exposed to Carthaginian aggression. Affairs grew continually more hopeless till Agathocles, the son of a potter, seized the tyranny, 316. Like Dionysius I, he was a soldier of fortune, who through sheer ability and resolution mounted to the summit of power. His methods and career closely paralleled those of the earlier tyrant. By clever diplomacy, sheer luck, and a show of force, by a combination of harshness and mildness, he entrenched himself in a power and gained the hegemony over the Greek cities of the island. The chief military event in his career was a long and desperate war with Carthage. The Sicilians had not yet developed a political consciousness of their nationality, but vacillated between him and the Semites, as the selfish considerations of the moment dictated. On one occasion, when besieged in Syracuse by a greatly superior force, with no allies to bring him aid and no means of repelling the enemy, he conceived the amazing scheme of running the blockade and of transferring the war to Africa. This bold design laid bare the weakness of Carthage. Her dependent towns were unfortified and disloyal, and she was exposed to the invader's attack. This campaign, though only a partial success, proved the beginning of his good fortune. Notwithstanding victories, he was finally compelled to make a treaty which divided the island nearly equally between himself and the enemy. After this event, he assumed the title of King of the Sicilians in the same way that the successors of Alexander were taking upon themselves the royal title. With these sovereigns, Agathocles, through diplomatic marriages, entered into close relations. Meanwhile, he gave aid to the Hellenic cities of Italy against the native Lucanians, and gained for his realm a strip of Italian coast. The chief aim of his life, however, was the expulsion of the Phoenicians from Sicily, and in his old age he resumed preparations for a gigantic struggle with the national enemy. To this end, he negotiated a treaty of alliance with Macedon. At least there dawned the hope that the Hellenes were so organized in east and west as to maintain themselves and gain new ground. The realization of the dream of Agathocles would have given the western Mediterranean to Hellenism and have changed the course of the world's history. In the midst of his preparations, however, he died, 289. In his last moments, he restored the republic to the Syracusans, necessarily with its fatal weaknesses. With his death, vanished the dream of a great champion of Hellenism, of a statesman and warrior scarcely excelled in administrative ability and in boldness combined with prudence. The growing power of Rome. The Western Greeks were confronted by enemies so powerful and aggressive that the only opportunity for national independence lay in centralization under a military monarch. The truth they were unable to appreciate, and accordingly the death of Agathocles made their situation desperate. Although in Italy the Sabellians had spent their energy, what they failed to conquer became the prey of Rome. This city, situated on the lower Tiber, became appreciably to extend her power about 400 BC with the conquest of Veii, an Etruscan city in the neighborhood. Conquered territory Rome either annexed, settling it with her own people and incorporating the acquired population as citizens, or subjected to her military command by treaties of alliance. Her just treatment of dependents and friends, no less than the severity with which she punished revolting allies, contributed to the growth and the solidity of her power. In a series of Latin and Samnite wars, 343 to 290, involving conflicts also with Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls, She extended her supremacy over the peninsula from the Rubicon River to the Greek settlements in the extreme south. In 326, Naples entered into the Roman alliance. Like most allies of Rome, she retained self-government in local affairs but gave military aid in war. As a maritime state, her chief military obligation lay in furnishing ships of war together with their crews. Meanwhile, the still free Hellenic cities of Italy were making little concerted effort to preserve their liberty. There was a union among them, but it counted for little. Tarentum, the most populous and wealthy, sought and obtained aid of her mother city Sparta, and afterward of Epirus. Unwilling to submit to discipline or military authority, and fearing for their precious liberties, the luxurious inhabitants nullified all such assistance by the reluctance of their cooperation. After Rome had extended her supremacy into southern Italy, Thurii, Rhegium, and Locri entered her alliance on substantially the same terms as Naples. Tarentum alone, with a few unimportant allies, remained independent. Pyrrhus in Italy. When Roman aggressions forced Tarentum into war, she appealed to Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, who came with an army of 25,000 men organized in the Macedonian system. 6 years he waged war against the Romans in Italy and the Carthaginians in Sicily. Had he been well supported by the Greeks, he might have secured their national freedom and have organized them in a kingdom for himself. But, though a brilliant general, Pyrrhus wanted statesman-like tact, and the Hellenes were too fond of their licenses of peace to sustain his absolute command and to fill the gaps in his ranks. Finally, he returned to Epirus 275, and 3 years afterwards Tarentum surrendered to the Romans, who in this way completed their supremacy over Italy. It was inevitable that Rome and Carthage, the two great powers of the West, should clash. In a long severe war, Rome achieved the task that had proved too great for Dionysius, Agathocles, and Pyrrhus, the expulsion of the Carthaginians from Sicily. Instead of the emergence of a Greek nation, however, there resulted ultimately a deadening bondage, loss of political freedom, economic retrogression, depopulation, and a rapid decline of culture. Despite obvious advantages, the Roman conquest proved in the end an irredeemable calamity. Hellenistic kingdoms of the East. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the East were longer lived. Egypt, a strongly centralized monarchy protected by the deserts that bordered the Nile Valley, feared no assailant so long as she could maintain a powerful navy. The Seleucid realm covered a vast territory but lacked the central strength necessary to the control of distant satrapies. One by one, India, Bactria, Parthia, and other faraway dependencies successfully revolted. In Asia Minor, a horde of invading Celts founded the kingdom of Galatia, while further to the west, Pergamum became an independent monarchy. Pontus, Cappadocia, and other old kingdoms reasserted themselves. These uprisings soon reduced the Seleucid sovereignty over Asia Minor to an empty name. In contrast with the Seleucid realm, Macedon was compact, and her inhabitants were virile and warlike. The ambition of her kings to rule over Greece met its chief obstacle in the Aetolian and Achaean leagues, which in the 3rd century, absorbing a great part of the peninsula, developed a respectable military power. The degree of Macedonian control varied with the ability of the kings, and although for considerable stretches of time the Greek states enjoyed independence, in the end the Macedonian king Antigonus gained the headship of nearly the whole peninsula, 221. Recognizing the federal principle, he joined existing combinations in a general union, a league of leagues, represented by a federal diet. This measure, while securing the essentials of republicanism, brought Macedon to preeminence as a military power. First Macedonian War, 215 to 205. Philip, successor to Antigonus, saw in Hannibal's invasion of Italy an opportunity to strike a deadly blow at this power of Rome, which recently had encroached upon the Macedonian sphere of influence by wars with the Illyrian pirates. But he gave Hannibal no substantial aid, and only roused against himself a new and powerful foe. In Roman history, this period of hostilities with Philip is known as the First Macedonian War, 215 to 205. From this time, The political interest centers in the extension of the Roman power over the eastern half of the Mediterranean world. The Italian nation was mainly agricultural. The masses were free peasants who, as a rule, owned the lands they tilled. They were laborious, hardy, and belligerent, and the government at Rome was a centralized aristocracy that rested its principal claim to leadership upon the successful conduct of war and diplomacy. In the Carthaginian, Seleucid, and Egyptian domains, the masses were nearly serfs, wholly unfit for war, and most of the fighting men accordingly were mercenaries. Among all the states were antipathies frequently breaking out in war, and rendering them weak in the face of a powerful enemy. Certain Greek states invited Rome to engage on their behalf in a war against Philip, 200 to 196. With the aid of the Aetolians, Flaminius, the consul in command, inflicted a decisive defeat on the Macedonians at Cynoscephalae, 197. Declaring the Greek states free from Macedon and under the protection of Rome, the victor withdrew his forces. Roman conquests. No long time afterward, the Romans waged war against Antiochus the Seleucid, who had shown great ability in restoring the empire. They defeated him at Magnesia, 189, and compelled him to yield to them all territory west of Mount Taurus. A third Macedonian war, culminating in the Battle of Pydna, 168, put an end to the kingdom of Macedon. For the time being, Rome organized no provinces in this part of the world, but extended her protectorate from the Adriatic to Mount Taurus. Although her governing class included many a Philhellene, inevitably the more brutal side of her nature revealed itself in Greek affairs. Fatal was the inability of the Hellenes to combine. In every state existed a Romanizing party which constantly invited interference. It required but a slight pretext to bring an army into Greece. In 146, the province of Macedonia was established, the military power of the Achaean League broken, Corinth destroyed, and the Greek states were subjected to the governor of Macedonia. This was the year in which Rome destroyed Carthage and converted her immediate domain into the province of Africa. 20 years afterward, the kingdom of Pergamon was converted into the province of Asia, 126. Meanwhile, the Seleucid realm rapidly shrank, and the dynasty came to an end, 83. In 63, Syria became a province, and the Roman Empire was thus extended to the Euphrates River. While these events were taking place in Asia, Egypt had greatly declined, and the Ptolemies were now subservient to Rome. In the year 30, their line ceased with the suicide of Cleopatra, whereupon Egypt was formally subjected under a prefect appointed by the Roman princeps. The effect of Roman conquest on civilization in Greece and the Orient was substantially the same as in southern Italy and Sicily. The conquerors robbed their subjects of material resources and art treasures, of their freedom of thought and speech, of everything in brief that might have conduced to the further upbuilding or even perpetuation of culture. Despite the good intentions of the principals and the obvious benefits of peace, the imperial administration, added to the pernicious activities of avaricious Roman speculators, grew continually more oppressive and grinding. Viewed in this light, the Roman conquest operated as the first and most fundamental cause of the decline of ancient civilization. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28. The organization and administration of the Hellenistic states, 337 to 30 BC. Local organization of Alexander's empire. Our knowledge of the local organization of Alexander's empire, inherited from the Persians and modified by himself and his successors, is extremely scant, excepting for Asia Minor and Egypt. The conqueror began the work of reorganization soon after the victory of Granicus, when the Hellenic cities along the western coast of Anatolia came onto his hands. These communities he treated with the utmost consideration. The oligarchies and tyrannies which had favored Persia he overthrew, and recalling the exiles he established democracies. The cities were left autonomous under a body of laws approved by the king.
They were to recognize him as their leader in war, and to furnish naval and land forces to serve under his command. Those especially favored were exempt from all payments, whereas the free city-states which had not won their way to the king's good graces rendered an annual payment made honorable by the title of contributions. All classes of cities thus far mentioned were looked upon as allies. Others, which had dared resist his arms, were held, at least temporarily, in subjection and compelled to pay the ordinary tribute. Roads. Among the Greek cities to profit most by the conquest were those along the western coast and on the neighboring islands of Asia Minor, not only through their enlarged opportunity for commerce, but also through the paternal favor of the kings. The most brilliant city of the region was Rhodes, which had taken the place of Piraeus as the commercial center of the Aegean area and had extended her lines of traffic throughout the Mediterranean world. In 170, her revenue from imports and exports, probably at the uniform rate of 2%, was 1,000,000 drachmas, which represents a commerce diminutive according to modern standards, but splendid for that age. This state maintained her independence by the bravery of her citizens, and her policy was to cultivate peace and friendship with the entire world. As a result, wealth abounded. The poor were provided for by the government, and the rich lived luxuriously in sumptuous dwellings. The city was not only a storehouse for merchandise, but the home of art and eloquence. The citizens were intelligent and maintained a high sense of public honor. Temple estates. In the interior of Asia Minor, the task of adapting existing conditions to the will of the conquerors remained to the Seleucidae. Here were found two forms of feudal estates, centering respectively in the square turreted castles of the grandees and in the temples. The castles had existed from the 8th century BC and had been tolerated perforce by Lydian and Persian kings. In the course of centuries, the Hellenistic rulers suppressed them and either incorporated these states in the royal domain or assigned them to cities. In the temple estate, the priest had control of the extensive lands belonging to it and exercised authority over the people, who in some communities were numbered by the thousands. Among them were attendants on the deity, but the great majority cultivated the soil as peasants. At the annual festival in honor of the deity, there was held a fair, at which the peasants could display their produce for sale and make purchases of the traders who came in from neighboring lands. The gathering of the people from near and far for worship, trade, and pleasure was a source of profit to the priests. The Hellenistic kings dared not suppress these religious potentates, but deprived them of political power, and in some instances of a part of their territory. Often the king settled a colony on the temple estate, and subjected the priests to the government of the new city. Alexander's plan of colonization. Alexander founded a great number of colonies, more than 70 as Plutarch states, distributing them over the empire in accordance with its needs, and the Seleucidae, following in his footsteps, planted an equal number. They were to provide homes for the worn-out veterans, to garrison the conquered country, and, at least in Alexander's plan, to Hellenize the empire. As a rule, therefore, they included a nucleus of retired soldiers and of Greek businessmen, around whom clustered a multitude of natives. Among the mercenaries of the Seleucidae, however, were few Greeks, and in general it may be said that Hellenic civilization penetrated but a little way beyond the walls of the colony. Among the largest, Alexandria numbered 300,000 free souls, and perhaps 100,000 slaves. Antioch, the Seleucid capital, was but slightly inferior, whereas Seleucia on the Tigris continued to grow till in the 1st century of our era the population numbered 600,000. The wealth of Egypt. The importance of Alexandria came not merely from her position as capital of a wealthy kingdom, but even more from her commercial activities. Her harbors brought her into touch with the whole Mediterranean world, while her canal, which connected her with the Nile, was the first stage in the long voyage to India. From the Nile it was possible to convey merchandise to the Red Sea, either by canal or overland. Usually, however, the merchant fleets of Egypt sailed along the coast of Arabia till they met and exchanged cargoes with the fleets of India. Under the late Ptolemies this traffic declined, to be magnificently revived by Augustus. In addition to commerce, Egypt derived great wealth from her manufactures. Her shops produced substantially all the papyrus used throughout the world, and with the vast number of writers in the city, the publication of books became a thriving business. The aromatics imported from Arabia and from far off India were here transformed into incense and toilet perfumes. Drugs and medicines were prepared for use. In the neighborhood, an abundance of vitrifiable earth was employed for the production of glass of very rich colors. Equally important were the textiles, including tapestries and both coarse and fine dress materials. The fine linens of biblical renown were woven in various localities and brought down to Alexandria for export. Doubtless many articles of use and luxury were manufactured here for home consumption or export of which we have no knowledge. The greatest product of the country was wheat. The hard labor of millions of peasants under the strict supervision of the Ptolemies yielded not only enough to supply home needs, but an enormous quantity for exportation. Antioch and Seleucia. In like manner, Antioch, situated on the Orontes River, about 12 miles from the Mediterranean, was not only an imperial capital, but the beginning of a great caravan route from the sea to Mesopotamia and Persia. With the conquest of the Orient, the Greeks had ceased to be a purely maritime people, and were conducting an extensive overland trade along the network of roads built by the Persian kings and their Hellenistic successors. East of Antioch, the route passed through Seleucia, which was also the chief trading intermediary between the Persian Gulf and the upper waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was the successor of Babylon and the parent of Baghdad. Blending of nationalities. The proportion of Greek to foreigners must have varied greatly according to circumstances. Naucratis, Egypt, for example, contained natives, but the Greeks of that city held aloof from social and marital relations with them, and therefore maintained their language in relative purity. Ptolemais, Egypt, seems to have been equally exclusive. Alexandria, on the other hand, was exceedingly mixed. To Greeks and Macedonians must be added Egyptians, Semites, Persians, and many other nationalities. These people were by no means equal. As a rule, the Macedonians and Hellenes, generally grouped together as Greeks, were the only citizens. They had their tribes and demes like those of Athens, their magistrates, council, and assembly. People of other speech were only metics with such rights as the city and the king assured them. In the country and the native towns, the Greeks formed but a small percentage of the population. Mercenaries of that nationality on lands held directly from Ptolemy, and small businessmen scattered widely along the Nile Valley, were more inclined to intermarry with the natives, and from these unions arose a hybrid class who spoke two tongues and bore both Greek and native names. Satrapies. The subject territory, as distinguished from the free Hellenic cities, was organized, as under Persian rule, in great administrative districts termed satrapies. It was clearly the conqueror's intention to employ both natives and Macedonians as satraps, while taking the precaution of transferring their military powers to special officers of his own nationality. This attempt to win the Persian aristocracy in his conflict with Darius proved a failure, and in the end he was obliged to substitute Macedonians as governors. A check on the satraps was found in keeping the commanders of great cities and fortresses directly dependent on the king, and even more in the separation of the financial from the military and civil administration. The finances of Egypt, for example, Alexander placed in the hands of Cleomenes, a Greek of Naupactus. During the long absence of the conqueror in the northeast and east, Cleomenes, through his absolute control of the revenue, made himself in reality dictator of Egypt, and used his authority for frightful extortions. The treasury of the empire was established at Babylon in charge of Harpalus, a friend of the conqueror's youth. During the long absence of the king, Harpalus squandered a great part of the treasury and escaped with the rest to Greece. In greed and disloyalty he was but a type of the high officialdom of the new empire. Failure to assimilate European and Asiatic troops. No obstacle, however, discouraged Alexander from his purpose of blending Asiatics and Europeans in one race socially and politically equal. He had married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, and afterward added a wife from each of the two royal Persian lines. At the same time, his great field marshals, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Nearchus, and other high officials to the number of 80, took to themselves Persian brides. On all without exception Alexander bestowed dowries. At the same time he made presents to the 10,000 Macedonian troops who had married Asiatic women. From the beginning of his campaigns, Alexander had introduced native troops into his army, and the majority of the force with which he invaded India were Asiatics. After his return he planned to dismiss the aged and crippled Macedonians and to substitute for them 30,000 native youths trained and equipped in Macedonian style. The veterans, finding themselves about to be displaced by men of a race whom they despised, were mortally offended and broke out in mutiny. The king yielded to the extent of giving his Macedonian forces the higher honor and pay. Despite every effort, the attempt to assimilate Europeans and Asiatics in the army proved a failure, and it was abandoned after his death. A universal empire. While temporizing with his Macedonian troops, Alexander steadily advanced toward the goal of his ambition, a universal empire emancipated from every national restriction, an empire that knew no distinction of race or people. It was a new conception, far broader than anything the world had known before, and formed the political basis for a larger idea of humanity afterward taking form in Stoicism and Christianity. Although there survived feebly a spark of popular sovereignty in the military assembly of Macedonians, the source of power had become the person of the monarch. The absolute idea grew upon Alexander throughout his conquests, largely as a product of his own experiences. The young king's extreme exertions, his incessant activity night and day, his physical sufferings from numerous wounds, and his excessive inclination to drink, while impairing his physical condition, cooperated with his marvelous successes in greatly affecting his mind. Month by month his companions saw in him a growing love of flattery and an increasing irritability at every opposition, however slight. No longer content with ordinary subservience, he demanded worship. For that is what prostration meant to a Greek or a Macedonian. Most of those who followed him through Asia, dependent as they were upon his caprice, granted him the honor with varying sincerity. Not satisfied with their homage, he permitted it to be made known to the Hellenic cities of the homeland that they ought to decree him a god. With characteristic independence, the Lacedaemonians replied, "Since Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be one." At Athens, Demosthenes at first protested, but afterward, changing sides, advised his countrymen to give the bauble. Let us acknowledge him the son of Zeus for all I care, or the son of Poseidon if he prefers it. Athens accordingly decreed to place him as Dionysus among the gods of the city. Other states took similar action. Temples for his worship arose in various places, and on his return from Babylon, he gave audience to, quote, "sacred legations," end quote, rather than political embassies come from Hellas to pay him divine honors. The god-king introduced into Europe. Among the Greeks, the boundary between human and divine had never been sharply drawn. Great men in death became heroes, and the god Dionysus had lived as a man on earth. Every Greek state rested on a religious foundation, and it was but natural that Alexander should seek such a basis for his empire. The Orient supplied the atmosphere of servile adoration of the king as superman or god. To this condition Hellenic thought and usage had to be adapted. Among the Greeks, the motive to his deification was fear, or the desire to flatter, or the hope of gaining favor. A common sentiment, too, was the desire for protection, or gratitude for deliverance from peril. Hence the frequent epithet savior applied to Hellenistic kings. Alexander must have assumed the title of divinity not merely to satisfy his craving for honors, but as the last step towards absolutism. Even on the throne, a mere man was bound at least by the general laws of humanity, and was responsible to public opinion. But a god was above all law and accountability. After some hesitation, his successors followed his example, and thus perpetuated the god-king. In this manner was introduced into Europe an essentially Oriental idea of the relation between the state and the individual. While Egyptians and Asiatics were groveling in the dust before their kings, the Greek republics had created for at least a part of their population a condition of freedom under self-government. In the individual, the result was the perfection of manliness, the development of a high type of self-control and self-respect. In society and governments, a recognition of the dignity and worth of the individual souls that made up the body politic. The Hellenistic kingdom, however, put an end to the growth of freedom, and in its stead universalized the Oriental slavery of the people, and gave it an indefinite lease of life. However sagacious, men were no longer to govern themselves or to give expression to their views for the improvement of state and society. Government was to rest in the hands of a god or of a superior sacred human being with a mandate from God, who brooked no opposition and needed no control, who selfishly or benevolently devised and executed with divine wisdom whatever he pleased for mankind. The idea passed on from Alexander to the Roman principals and the Byzantine emperors, and to the modern monarchs who rule by divine right. While the government of Macedon rested on the traditional basis of nationality, that of the Seleucid realm and of Egypt was an artificial structure. The administrative system was an organization of Greek conquerors for the exploitation of the natives, and was wholly devoid of national or patriotic feeling. The masses might sincerely accept the godship of the sovereign, but his appeal to the higher officials could only reach their self-interest, their hope of reward, or fear of punishment. The want of moral fiber that only patriotism and national feeling could supply was a fundamental weakness of both kingdoms. The Aetolian League, the Achaean League. With the Hellenistic kingdoms we may contrast the federations of the Greek homeland. The union established by Philip, arbitrarily created and abounding in discord, proved short-lived. Soon afterward, the Aetolian League came into prominence. Originally an ethnos of primitive character, Aetolia began toward the close of the 4th century to assume the character of a union of cities. Early in the 3rd, she annexed Delphi, and thereafter employed the influence of the Amphictyoni in rapidly extending her league till it came to include nearly all central Greece, southern Thessaly, and temporarily various cities of Peloponnese. In like manner, Achaea, beginning as an ethnos, changed somewhat more slowly to the federal organization of city-states. It was not till the inclusion of Sicyon in 251 that the Achaean League could count as a power in Greece. Thereafter followed the admission of Corinth and other neighbors in rapid succession, till, early in the 2nd century, it included all Peloponnese. There was rivalry between the two leagues, involving the shifting of cities back and forth, together with frequent Macedonian interference. Although both leagues engaged in forcible annexations, the great majority of admissions were at the request of the incoming states. Government of the leagues. The general principles of organization were the same for the two leagues. The fundamental institution of government was the assembly of all the citizens, like that of the city-state. It is known that in the Achaean League the voting was by cities. Presumably all present from a given city determined among themselves the attitude to be taken by their state, which thereupon probably cast a single vote, whatever its population. By the side of the assembly, as in the city-state, was the council, in the Aetolian League and probably in the Achaean, representing the cities according to their population. Elections of magistrates and other matters of primary importance fell to the assembly, whereas the council, with its more frequent sessions, gave attention to lesser business and to such as could not await the gathering of the people. The chief magistrate was the general. In the Achaean League there were at first 2 and afterward 1, the commander of the army and highest civil executive. The abandonment of the old republican board of officers in favor of a single magistrate added efficiency to the administration. Federal government. The federal government had control of weights, measures, and coinage. It conducted negotiations with foreign powers, declared war, and contracted alliances. In sole command of the military forces, it gave orders to the members to furnish their several contingencies. Each constituent city was guaranteed autonomy under a republican constitution, implying security and justice for herself and her individual citizens. Her chief obligation was to put into the field the number of troops demanded and to support them at her own expense. In the preservation of liberty, the federal union contrasted favorably with the kingdoms of that age, and in the development of strength it was a great improvement upon the city-state. A solution of the most difficult of Hellenic problems was at length found in the creation of a system of organization adapted to the Greek character. It is true that in time of war the federal government, in entrusting to the states the levy and support of soldiers, remained excessively weak, and it was a misfortune that the two rival leagues existed side by side, often at war with each other, while their freedom was menaced by the greatly superior powers of the Hellenic kingdoms and the Roman Republic. Their inability to survive under these adverse conditions does not detract from the truth that the Federal Union was the most highly developed political creation of the world before the rise of modern representative democracies, such as those of Great Britain and the United States. Royal domains. The gigantic empire of Alexander and his successors' kingdoms rested on a condition of the laboring masses which verged closely upon serfdom. Round about the free cities in Western Asia Minor, and more extensively in other parts of the realm, were the great domains of the Persian king, which Alexander seized for himself. They were cultivated by peasants who lived in villages and were bought and sold along with the lands they tilled, who were not absolutely bound to the soil, but could move about from one locality to another, evidently with the permission of their lord. Not wholly at the mercy of their local master, they were under the jurisdiction and legal protection of judges appointed for them by the king. They paid their sovereign a tribute in money or in kind, a tenth of the annual produce. There were peasants too on the feudal estates and on the communal lands of cities, who rendered their dues to the lord of the commonwealth. These arrangements had existed under the Persian rule and were adopted with little modification by Alexander. Similar were conditions in Egypt. While retaining proprietorship of all the soil, Ptolemy gave the income of many large estates to his officials and other favorites. The temples also held and granted broad, fertile tracts. To his mercenaries the king gave permission on fixed terms to reclaim and use waste lands. In peace, these clerics, lot holders, made their living by agriculture, but stood ever ready to answer the sovereign's call to arms. Vast tracts of grain land, specifically described as royal domain, were leased in small lots to peasants, who had to render a fixed number of measures to the acre. The king possessed the monopoly of the oil industry and required for his use the production of a certain number of oil plants in each nome, administrative district. Oppression of laborers. The ordinary tributes, though heavy, were endurable, but the natives were subject to many other taxes, and were required to perform in addition a variety of labors for which they received no pay, including the erection of royal buildings, the entertainment of traveling officials and of soldiers quartered upon them, the building and repair of dams and embankments along the Nile, the maintenance and extension of the whole irrigation system, and the reclaiming of waste lands. The capricious and arbitrary enforcement of these labors, which took no account of the peasants' necessities, proved exceedingly oppressive. The laborers were kept under continual watch. Day and night custodians from the mercenary class guarded the crops, lest the peasant take something for himself before the king has had his share. And while the aim of the administration was to confine the whole laboring population to its endless routine of toil, the growers of oil plants were the most rigorously bound to the soil. If they neglected their work to the extent of journeying to another nome, they might be arrested and forced back to their wearisome tasks. Decline of democracy. In fact, the most deplorable feature of life in the Hellenistic Orient was the abject condition of the laborers. The voiceless multitude meekly accepted the terms of rent, purchase, and sale imposed upon them by those in authority. Though not precisely serfs, they were on the very brink of serfdom. In Europe, with rare exceptions, the native laborers of a community, as distinguished from the slaves, were free, and in democracies enjoyed the right to vote. A characteristic feature of the change from the 4th century to the Hellenistic age, however, was the decline of the democracy and of the laboring class. The masses were adversely affected by the economic developments attending the conquest of the Orient. Great wealth in land and money fell into the hands of Alexander's officers and of the aides and favorites of his successors, or of adventurers in business, while people of moderate means became fewer and the poverty of the masses increased. in every considerable city swarmed the proletarians, who could find no adequate employment and lived on the edge of starvation. As a class, they were no more to be blamed for their poverty than the few were to be praised for their wealth. If left to themselves, they could but die of hunger. In the interest of self-preservation, therefore, various cities, not simply Rhodes, Samos, and Carthage, but in time even Rome, found it necessary to supply them with a cheap or free grain. In both Greece and Rome, reformers attempted the economic and political redemption of the masses, but they could not prevail over the opposition of the rich. At the opening of the Christian era, democracy had almost totally vanished from the civilized world, and with it the thought that the poor might as a class be educated and treated with the consideration due to human souls. 3.5 centuries later, they were in a serfdom whose beginnings had been borrowed from the Orient, and it has been but recently, during the early centuries of modern times, that they have regained their freedom. General decline of the homeland. The Greek homeland suffered through the easterly migration of her most ambitious and enterprising sons, which left the peninsula poorer in creative energy and intelligence. Another factor that afforded a powerful impetus to her decline was the eastward shifting of commercial centers. From the 7th to the 4th centuries, the coast of Greece, washed by the Aegean Sea, belonged to the heart of Hellas, from which extended trade arteries to every part of the Mediterranean world. As the Hellenes expanded over Egypt and Western Asia, however, the center of commerce moved after them from Piraeus to Rhodes and Alexandria. The Athenian port lost nearly all its life, and the greater part of the trade left to the vicinity shifted to Corinth, which attained a new splendor as the occasional residence of the Macedonian kings. These circumstances made it the largest, wealthiest, and most beautiful city of the peninsula till its destruction at the hands of the Romans. Not least effective in thinning the population and destroying property were the wars between city-states or federal unions, or between the Macedonian kings and the Hellenes, wars not less frequent than before the days of Philip and Alexander. Doubtless, too, the continued wasting of the soil and the spread of malaria tended further to rob the inhabitants of food and to sap their vitality. To all these destructive forces we must add the rising standard of living, the love of comfort and luxury, which induced men either to remain single or, if they married, to bring up few, if any, children, with the result that the number and the size of families rapidly diminished. Although not hopeless at the time of the Roman subjugation, 146, the condition of the peninsula under the Romans steadily deteriorated till, early in the Christian era, the Hellenic Strabo could only describe the homeland of freedom and science in terms of desolation. End of chapter 28.
29. Hellenistic Culture, Part 1, 337-30 before Christ. First, city construction and art. City construction, Priene. The Hellenistic age, with its conquest and colonization, was a period of city construction. So far as the nature of the surface permitted, the builders applied the principle of straight streets crossing each other at right angles. The requirements of defense, however, still left the ways narrow and reduced the public squares to the smallest areas. The recent excavation of Priene, a town of about 4,000 inhabitants, has given us a clearer idea of this period than we could have been able to acquire in any other way. It stands on a height with steep descents on every side, so that the need of fortification was minimized. The circuit wall, of unknown height, is 2 meters in thickness and is pierced by 3 gates covered with round arches. Arriving from the port, we passed through the cemetery and into the western gate, thence along a narrow street to the provision market, where the small dealers retailed bread, meat, and other victuals. Adjoining it is the great market, the centre of public life. In the middle is a large altar, and along the border, on all 4 sides, runs a colonnade, which fronts a succession of stores, temples, and other buildings that surround the market. The north side is occupied by a sacred portico, in which the people held festival and sat on holidays at banquets provided by the city's expense. Other public buildings are the Assembly Hall, with a sitting capacity of about 500, serving for the meetings of citizens and of the council, the theatre, and various temples. That of Athena, the gift of Alexander, was elegant and artistic, the pride of the city. As a Greek community, the Prienians could not live without a stadium and a gymnasium. Public life. Although they drew their chief subsistence from their farms nearby, they also manufactured a few wares which they shipped abroad through their port. Public life was wholesome. Candidates for office sought the votes of their fellow citizens, and as magistrates they devoted a share of their private income to the improvement of the city and the entertainment of the people. In return, the citizens granted them exemption from public burdens, front seats at the theatre and festivals, and honorary statues, many of which were set up in the sacred portico. The people were industrious, intelligent, moral, and happy. Larger cities differed chiefly in the proportionally greater attention to industry and commerce, and the increased contrasts between the few rich and the many poor, in the splendor of public buildings and of the homes of the wealthy. Temples showed in an accentuated degree the features whose beginnings were witnessed by the second half of the 4th century. A remarkable development of the age was the great altar of Zeus at Pergamum, about 100 feet square. The construction may be studied in the picture. The actual altar stood on the top of this monument in the center of a court surrounded by an Ionic colonnade. The frieze is described below among the sculptures. Notable, too, was the gigantic lighthouse at Alexandria, on the island of Pharos, which gave its name to the structure. It was more than 100 meters high. The summit was reached within by a ramp surrounding the open shaft in which an elevator conveyed the material for the light. Water supply and sanitation. In choosing a site for a city, regard was had to the water supply as well as to agricultural and commercial advantages. For example, Priene had abundant spring water brought into the city in large earthen pipes, filtered and distributed to the houses through smaller pipes. The larger aqueducts of more populous cities were subterranean channels lined with stone and cement. In this period, increased attention was paid to sanitation. Whereas at Smyrna, new built, after lying for centuries in ruins, the refuse from the houses lay in the streets to be washed about over the pavement by rains, Ephesus seems to have been well provided with sewers, and in some, if not in all cities, there were officials who had charge of sanitation, and in some dwellings at Priene have been found sanitary arrangements comparable with those of today. Family life. Family life still secluded itself from the public gaze. A dwelling at Priene presented to the street a bare windowless wall, pierced at one end by a single door. In visiting the home of an average citizen, we passed through this door into a waiting room, and thence into an open court with cemented floor. This space, whence the family received their air and light, is surrounded by rooms. The one at the back, adorned with 2 columns, is the living room of the house. Here stands the altar. Here guests were received, and here the family usually gathered at meals. In a house so sumptuous as to have a second story, the upper floor was occupied by the women. The houses of the wealthy, imitating the royal palaces, developed a system of 2 courts, each surrounded by a colonnade, and usually adorned with a fountain and flowers. In the inner court centred the private life of the family and the industrial activities of the household. About it were the rooms in which the female slaves lived and plied their labours, such as spinning, weaving, grinding grain, and baking. Here, too, was the sleeping room of the parents, another for the daughters, and 1 or more dining rooms. The outer or front court, open as it was to guests, was only richer and more stately. The building throughout was beautified with statues, mural paintings, and coloured marbles, with finely woven and embroidered tapestries, and some of the floors with mosaics. The furniture was of bronze, ivory, and rare imported woods. The construction and furnishing of such a home drew upon the resources of the whole civilized world, and was only rendered possible by an extensive commerce on sea and land. Sculptures of the age. Among the extant sculptures of the age are reliefs which decorated public buildings. Perhaps the most striking representatives of this class are to be found at Pergamum. This city, the seat of Attalus and his dynasty, is the only Hellenistic capital thus far thoroughly excavated. So much architecture and sculpture have been found there, so well are we acquainted with the material civilization of the place, that it must be taken as the starting point for a study of the royal capitals of the age. Attalus I, 241-197, secured the peace of his kingdom by an overwhelming defeat of the Galatians. A memorial of this deed was the frieze which adorned the exterior of the monument on which stood the great altar of Zeus. It represents the combat of gods and giants as a symbol of the struggle of civilization against barbarism. As the frieze is above 7 feet in height, the colossal features give a physical impression of the superhuman. To the Pergaminis, it was a historical picture of living national interest. In facial expression and in bodily attitude, in the animation of the gods and the fury of the giants, intenseness of muscle and heat of action, we see the spirit of Scopas highly accentuated. The whole scene may be well described as a mass of supermen convulsively struggling. A comparison with the frieze of the Parthenon, or even the frieze of the Mausoleum, shows a marked degeneration of taste. Despite its imposing magnificence, this relief offends by its exaggerations and by the sacrifice of naturalness and simplicity to the desire for effect. The Dying Gaul. A more realistic memorial of the same victory was a group of bronze figures representing a battle between Greeks and Galatians. Although all the originals have been lost, there remain marble copies of several figures. Among the latter is the Dying Gaul, in the Capitol Museum at Rome. It has the advantage of being nearly contemporary with the original, and of being itself the product of an Anatolian artist, who either belonged to the Pergamene school or worked under its influence. Strongly realistic, it represents both the ethnic and the individual peculiarities of the warrior. The coarse hair, pushed straight up from the forehead, the moustache, the necklace, the hardened skin, the fortitude that overcomes the death pain of the ugly stab in his side. We admire the perfect anatomy, made possible by the medical science of the age, and in brief, the fidelity to nature displayed by every part of the work. In the consideration of the Pergamini sculptures above offered, the characteristics of the age have been indicated. Although it is still possible here and there to find examples of restrained and dignified sculptures, the general features depart widely from the classical standard. The tendencies which we discovered in their infancy in the 4th century have become more pronounced. Self-restraint has waned, and the emotions have grown strong even to exaggeration. In portrait sculpture, an intense realism expresses and overemphasizes individual traits and even defects. The posture of human form becomes theatrical, sometimes violent. Groupings, draperies, and the general composition assume complex and elaborate forms. Patrons of art. The great patrons of art were the Hellenistic kings who ruled the divided empire of Alexander. While preserving a degree of Hellenic taste, they demanded an art commensurate with their own wealth and splendor. Palaces, city halls, theatres, and many other forms of architecture with the decorations of fitting intricacy and elaboration. To these demands the artists responded with a technique that was equal to every emergency. Aphrodite of Melos, made of Antium. A statue which is still widely regarded as the most beautiful of the age is the Aphrodite of Melos. We do not know the sculptor or the reason for the peculiar attitude. Perhaps the right hand held the drapery. The left foot is advanced and rests on slightly elevated ground. The statue is made of 2 pieces of marble, the unclad part of finer quality than the other. We see, too, in the style, a combination of the heavy Phaidian drapery with a Praxitelean head. Such eclecticism was common in the age, but seldom has it been effected with equal skill. Grace and dignity are more nearly balanced than is usual in this period. Another woman figure of the age, composed of 2 kinds of marble, is the so-called Maid of Antium. It was found in Nero's villa at Antium, whence it was removed in 1909 to the Museum of the Terme at Rome. The head and right shoulder are of pure white, the rest of the inferior material. She may be the daughter, or possibly the servant, of a priest of Apollo. On a tray she carries the implements of divination, and seems to be in the act of making a choice of the objects in an oracular response to an inquiry. The strong athletic form, the masculine proportions, and the sturdy stride benefit an attendant upon Apollo far more than average girl. Though some have assigned it to the 5th century and others to Praxiteles, it seems rather to be Hellenistic, and in that case it must be classed among the most distinguished statues of the age. The texture of the gown is unique, the attitude is natural, and the features and facial expression are charming. Amid the thousands of sculptures that people the museums of Rome, it is a figure that impresses the visitor with its rare personality. Nike of Samothrace. Another female statue deserving of mention is the Nike of Samothrace, which commemorates the naval victory of Demetrius Poliorcetes, stormer of cities, gained off Cyprus in 306. The monument was originally placed on a rocky height of Samothrace, whence it has been removed to the Louvre. The goddess stands erect on the prow of a ship, her wings expanded, her garments clinging in magnificent masses about her gigantic form, and streaming wildly behind her, blown by the onrush of the vessel. The head and arms are lost. But from her image on a coin, we learn that she held on her lips a trumpet, through which she heralded the glorious deed of her fosterling. It is the most splendid victory created by the ancient world. The Laocoon. The Laocoon is a product of the Rhodian school of sculptures, which was clearly akin to that of Pergamon. This group belongs to the 1st century before Christ and is here offered as an example of violent sensationalism. Laocoon and his 2 sons are being crushed in the folds of 2 enormous snakes. The intricate group thus formed is wrought with great technical skill. The violent death agonies of the 3 persons, expressed in the convulsions of facial and bodily muscles, are amazingly realistic. The anatomy is perfect, with one exception. For unknown reasons, the boys are given the forms of grown men. The chief fault lies in the choice of agony as a subject for sculptural treatment. The face of the father, too, should express not pain alone, but also horror and physical effort. The snakes are whole and true to nature. They are not large enough to crush a man, and serpents, which depend upon choking their victims, do not bite. Despite these and other faults, glaring indeed when measured by Phaedian and Praxitelian standards, the group is a work of positive merit, else it would not have excited the admiration of Renaissance artists. Life at Rhodes was commercial, like that of today, and the prominent aim of art, as in our own time, was to display the resources of wealth and the mighty ambition of a trading people in the production of the intricate, the ornate, and the stupendous. Thus, the Colossus of Rhodes finds its counterpart in our Liberty Enlightening the World, an appropriate gift to the United States. Children in art. Perhaps the most pleasing branch of Hellenistic art comprises representations of real life designated genere. For the first time in history, an interest began to be felt in children. Their physique was now carefully observed. Their facial expressions and their playful attitudes were naturally reproduced. We cannot doubt that this artistic development corresponded to a real change in social life. As the center of interest shifted from politics to the home, and a powerful impetus came from various directions to humanism, it was inevitable that children should attract their share of attention. At the same time, men sought a refuge from the artificiality of the city in the innocence and the simplicity of rural life and of childhood. Thus, it was in the spirit of the idyls of Theocritus that the sculpture created in relief scenes of rustic simplicity or statues of peasants and fisherfolk as well as of children. Deification of cities. A contrast to these light subjects is the deification of cities. Throughout Greek history, impersonation had been common, and city-states had generally been represented by their tutelary deities. In the 3rd century, Eutychides, a pupil of Lysippus, wrought for the people of Antioch a gilded bronze statue of the Fortune, Tyche, of their city. The deity was easily identified with Antioch itself. She is seated on a rock, as was the city, and the river flowing at her feet is represented by a swimming youth. The bunch of grain stalks in her hand symbolizes the fertility of the river valley, while the mural crown, the first known in art, signifies the walls of defense. The statue became an object of worship, and the idea was gradually extended to the city and to Rome. Painting in the Hellenistic Age. The Hellenistic age was as productive of painting as of every other form of art, but owing to the perishable material, our knowledge of it is imperfect. The most famous painter of the age was Apelles of Kos, a man of marvelous industry and a great master of technique. He used but 4 colors: black, white, red, and yellow. He alone had the art of covering the finished painting with a black glaze that improved the work by toning down the colors while protecting it from dampness. His painting of Aphrodite rising from the sea was especially celebrated. Brought to Rome with other booty from Hellas, it found a place in the temple of the deified Julius Caesar. We are fortunate in having a number of portraits on panels that had covered the faces of Greek and Jewish mummies in Egypt. Although belonging to the early Christian era, they well illustrate the work of the same kind in the Hellenistic period. The artists were without distinction, and yet the portraits are remarkably lifelike, and the colors are still bright. The wall paintings of Pompeii are also but a continuation of the house decorations of the Hellenistic age. They were hastily wrought by mechanics, yet many of the figures and groups are admirable. Doubtless the ultimate originals of many were the famous works of Hellenic masters. Of such lineage was the Medea, meditating on the murder of her sons. In a first struggle of soul, the mother instinct is overcome by rage against her unfaithful husband. Mosaics. An art new to the Greeks of this age, learned through contact with the Orient, was mosaic making. It could thrive nowhere but amid an abundance of stones of various colors, and as the work was exceedingly slow and painstaking, it could be carried on only where labor was cheap. These conditions were met in Egypt, and Alexandria was the seat of manufacture of many mosaics now found in Greek and Roman lands. The pattern was either a piece of tapestry or a picture. For example, the original of the Battle of Issus, found in a private house at Pompeii, was a painting of that conflict by Apelles or other great master. Darius, already beaten, is in flight. In his fear he drives his chariot wheels over the dead and dying, but king-like still he turns about to order succor to a fallen noble. Farther to our left, the figure of Alexander, mounted on Bucephalus, stands out distinctly as he charges in pursuit. It is remarkable that with scarcely more than 2,000 men and horses, the artist has created the effect of a great battle. As we gaze upon the picture, we see the melee of combatants in deadly strife. We seem to hear the groans of the dying, the clash of the lances, the clamour of struggling horsemen. Undoubtedly, the original was among the great historical paintings of the ancient world. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30. Hellenistic Culture, Part 2. 1. Philosophy. Philosophic change. The Cynics. It was but natural that the revolution in Hellenic government and society since the 4th century should be accompanied by a corresponding change in philosophy. All philosophic thought of the classic age had rested on two principles. First, the complete trust reposed in abstract thinking for the discovery of truth, and second, the perfect correspondence assumed between the inner man and the world without. This correspondence was supported by a religion which peopled nature with souls like those of men. It was partly this relation between the world and man which led the philosophers to believe that by mere thinking they could discover the principles of nature, and partly the circumstance that philosophic thought was as yet in its infancy, with its limitations unknown and the value of its products untested. With the breaking down of the city-state and of traditional religion, and the concomitant growth of individualism and humanism, philosophy, abandoning her original foundation, attempted to lay a new basis in the changed conditions of life. The ground had been prepared by Antisthenes of Athens, a disciple of Socrates, and an older contemporary of Plato. From his teaching in the gymnasium of the Cynosarges, his school was called Cynic. In his doctrine, virtue is the only good, vice the sole evil. Wealth, social position, honor, and country are nothing. A tattered mantle, a piece of barley bread and water are all that a man needs. We should renounce every bodily pleasure and comfort for the spiritual contentment derived from the exercise of virtue. Through the contempt of this school for convention, for nearly everything mankind holds dear, the word cynic has degenerated to its present meaning. It is a strange thing that while the city-state was still strong, Antisthenes foreshadowed by a century or more those systems of thought that were to be founded upon the ashes of Hellenism. The Stoics. Zenon, founder of the school. In the Hellenistic age, while the members of the Cynic school degenerated to boorish and brutal tramp philosophers, its better elements were adopted by the Stoics. The founder of the school was Zenon, a Semite of Cyprus who had come to Athens, 311. There, for a time, he studied with the Cynics, but 10 years later he began to teach independently in the Painted Porch, Stoa Poikile, which gave its name to his school. His Semitic nationality shows itself, not in the content of his teaching, which is Hellenic, but in its utterance. Stoicism is less rational, more dogmatic than any previous philosophy. Zenon's object was the molding of man's character to meet the difficulties of the world, and regardless of consistency he presented the doctrines suited to this end, implanting them in the minds of others less by reason than as the utterance of a prophet. It seemed to him, amid the wreck of religious and moral ideas formerly sustained by the city-state, that mankind needed a higher degree of individual self-sufficiency. To reach this end it is necessary, he taught, to train the will into conformity with nature, to desire only those things that are certain of realization independently of ourselves. In order to prove that this central doctrine is rational, and that it will assure happiness, Zenon developed a whole system of philosophy. It consists of 3 branches: logic, physics, and ethics. Logic includes a theory of knowledge. While the skeptics of his age were denying the possibility of knowing, Zenon insisted that we could accept as the truth all grasping impressions, the sense perceptions that come to us with irresistible strength. Whereas to the acute thinker this dictum was childish folly, it sufficed for a common-sense philosophy. Logic included also everything connected with the expression of thought and feeling, from grammar to rhetoric and music, as well as the forms of reasoning. In this department the Stoics contributed little to existing knowledge. In physics, the study of nature, their most startling dogma is that everything is material, even God and the human soul. The qualities of objects, emotions, virtues, and vices are all corporeal. In fact, the purely practical object of his system seemed to him to demand that it be grounded upon ordinary experience, which has to do primarily with material things. It is our common experience, too, that matter cannot move itself or take on living forms; nothing but a soul can bring about such changes. The world, therefore, has a soul. This is God, the reason and motive power of the universe. He is a providence who in loving care watches over the world and every part of it, who maintains it in physical and moral perfection. Everything in nature, therefore, is rational and good. Thus, from physics we pass imperceptibly to ethics. The soul of man is a part of the divine soul, and a virtuous life is conformity to nature. Everything that exists is advantageous to man, even sickness, noxious animals, earthquakes, and the like; they are intended for our education. Thus we are gradually led back to the central idea of Stoicism, that happiness, the supreme good, is reached by conforming our will to the laws of nature, which are absolutely rational and just. Stoicism, a religion. Stress should be placed on the fact that Stoicism was a religion. The only motive to right conduct, conformity to nature, is nothing more than submission to the will of God. It is a pure monotheism, the worship of one supreme being. As he wishes only well for us, and blesses but never harms, we, who are parts of him, have no reason to fear him, but should only revere and love. For this worship there is no need of altars or temples, or images, or even of prayer, but only of purity in life and thought. The gods of popular belief, with their foibles and vices, are creatures of the imagination, and the many myths are worthy only of contempt. To a certain extent, however, the Stoics compromised with popular faith. Just as the Christians grant the existence of angels and devils, the Stoics assume the activity of superhuman beings, called gods, but subject to the Supreme Being. In like manner, while repeating the literal content of myths, the Stoics were able to save them for a useful purpose, by giving them an allegorical interpretation. In this activity, they were but extending an invention of earlier philosophies. Necessarily, their interpretations were fantastical. For example, Heracles was not merely a strong man, but a great philosopher. His slaying of monsters signifies his conquest of human vices, and when he leads the three-headed dog from the netherworld to earth's surface, he is merely bringing to light the three heads of philosophy: logic, physics, and ethics. The effect was to purify myth of all immoralities, and to preserve the traditional religion while endowing it with a wholly new meaning. Effects of Stoicism. The trend of Stoicism, while strengthening religious faith, was to make the individual self-sufficient, independent of all externals, human and material, and to give him an absolute mastery of himself. He is lord of his own life, and may put an end to it when he judges best. Though he may have been suddenly converted to Stoicism, it is possible to grow in character throughout life, but only a few men of old, such as Socrates, have attained to a perfection of virtue. Society, too, exists, and the individual has social instincts, which are natural and therefore good. All the members of one body, all the parts of one God, bound together in a common sympathy. In striving to benefit our fellows, we do but obey a law of nature. While working out the problem of virtue, many Stoics were driven into seclusion or lived in a commonwealth of their own imagining, out of space and time, where no sordid ambitions or passions or human weaknesses found entrance, but all dwelt in perfect harmony and content. Others, in the hope of impressing their fellow men, mingled in society or became statesmen and rulers. Their creed, though appealing to the intellectuals rather than the mass, has served us as a positive force in the history of thought and conduct. It molded Roman law, it contributed to the humanism of Roman imperial times, at various points it proved akin to Christianity, and much of it, remaining in the ethics of today, still makes for strength and stability of character. Skepticism. In opposition to the Stoics, there were powerful forces of disintegration. There were skeptics, who, while accepting appearances as such, denied the possibility of real knowledge. Thoroughly typical of these disturbed conditions is the work of Euhemerus of Messana. In a book called Sacred Inscription, composed about 270, he pretended that on a visit to a distant island he found in a temple of Zeus an ancient inscription which detailed the origin and doings of the gods. It was there set forth that Zeus was once a man who had distinguished himself as king and conqueror, and had received divine worship in reward of his benefits, and similarly that all the deities, Apollo, Aphrodite, and the rest were once human beings who had attained to fame and had been raised to the rank of gods in human opinion, whereas in fact they died like all other mortals and are no more. While undermining what remained of the traditional faith, this book supported the deification of kings, which was coming into vogue at that time. Epicurus' system of philosophy. The philosophic system, however, which is rightly set down as the opponent of Stoicism, was that of Epicurus the Samian, founded in 310. His school, like the Stoa, was materialistic. He accepted substantially the atomic theory of Democritus. Even the soul, he asserted, is material and dissolves at death. As it is mortal, we have nothing to fear from a future life. Gods exist, but not those of popular faith. The real deities live apart from the world in unalloyed happiness, caring nothing for the human race. In the Epicurean system, as among the Stoics, the whole superstructure is occupied by ethics. The supreme good is apparently the same in both philosophies: happiness. With Epicurus, however, happiness is freedom from pain or from fear, which is mental suffering. The aim was not hedonism, but quietism. Pleasures and pains differ in degrees, and in making choice, the wise man will aim to avoid the severest and the most lasting pains, and to seek the highest and the most permanent pleasures. The delights of sensation are coarse and transitory, those of mind exalted and lasting. Hence, the wise man will choose poverty and bodily suffering if necessary to secure the highest pleasures. The intelligent Epicurean will be as virtuous as the Stoic, because through virtue he secures the utmost happiness. The founder of the school was himself an admirable character, and his object was undoubtedly to benefit his fellow men. His system, though it has many points of likeness to Stoicism, has been condemned by the tribunal of history. The reason is that it is essentially selfish. Individual man is his own all in all. Different from the Stoic, the Epicurean is subject to no spiritual ideal toward which he should strive. It is true that the system as originally taught produced a few eminently worthy characters, but its general effect has been demoralizing. The doctrine of happiness was too readily perverted, and Epicureanism became synonymous with the love of eating and drinking, with gluttony and the coarsest pleasures. 2. Hellenistic science. Progress of science. Fortunately for the progress of science, the task which Aristotle set for himself was not only the collection of facts and the organization of knowledge, but also the direction of his pupils to individual fields of research. His work continued, therefore, after his death. An added impetus to the study of geography and astronomy, of plants and animals, to discovery and invention in general was given by the marches of Alexander. Lastly, the interest of the Ptolemies in art and science devoted a goodly share of Egyptian wealth to collections and institutions for the furtherance of scholarly and scientific progress. Founding of libraries. One of the most necessary requisites to this work was the founding of a library. Under the earlier Ptolemies, a search for valuable manuscripts was made throughout the Hellenic world, and within a few years a collection was made of 500,000 books, volumes, rolls, which in time was further increased. This was the royal library, the greatest in the ancient world. A smaller collection was made in the temple of Serapis, Serapeon. Callimachus, a peripatetic of Cyrene, 310 to 240, one of the chief librarians, compiled a catalogue said to have filled 120 volumes, comprising the authors and their works in order. It included 2 short biographies of the authors and a few critical data for the valuation of the books. Briefer aids to the choice and use of books were added by various scholars. Other Hellenistic kings established libraries in their respective capitals, notably in Pergamum and Antioch, none of which equaled that of Alexandria. The Museum of Alexandria. The Museum of Alexandria was an association of scholars and investigators, like the Academy and the Lyceum, formed nominally for the worship of the Muses. Their president was a priest appointed by the king, who assigned them quarters in his palace, a large hall in which they took their meals in common, a garden with seats, and an agreeable place for walking. The members received money for support from the king's treasury. Critical knowledge. Members of this association and other learned men in the Aristotelian spirit mapped out the fields of knowledge, which they vigorously cultivated according to their several tastes. Under grammar, nearly equivalent to our philology, may be included everything relating to the study of language and of literature. Scholars, of whom we know scarcely more than the names, wrote histories of the various departments of literature, as the drama, poetry, and philosophy, and biographies of famous authors. A most valuable service was the comparison and criticism of manuscripts with a view to purifying the texts of errors and interpolations. This textual criticism centered in the poems of Homer. It had begun as early as the 5th century, but the first scholarly edition of Homer was prepared by Zenodotus, the first librarian at Alexandria, 285 to 260. It put the text substantially in the form in which we read it today. The division of the Iliad and the Odyssey into books was made either by this scholar or by his immediate successors. In his judgment, these were the only works of Homer, whereas others, the separatists, assigned the two poems to different authors. The texts of the classic poets and many prose writers were similarly treated, and minute commentaries on the language and the subject matter were prepared. Philology included also technical grammar, which had a relatively slow growth, prosody, and lexicons. The science spirit of Alexandria was Aristotelian, whereas that of the rival Pergamene school was Stoic. The most famous master at Pergamum was Crates from Cilicia, contemporary and opponent of Aristarchus. The Stoic love of allegory, prominent in this school's interpretation of the poets, blurred their scientific perception. This shortcoming is counterbalanced by greater attention to the subject matter of literature, rather than to textual criticism, and in general to the collection and organization of facts. Euclid. For the progress of physical science, a careful foundation in pure mathematics had to be laid. This service was performed by Euclides of Alexandria, who continued the mathematical studies of Plato and the Academy. His chief work, named Elements, still extant, is a treatise on geometry, so precise, clear, and logical that the moderns have been able to make little improvement upon it. Any textbook in geometry now studied in our schools is Euclid's Elements, with unimportant modification. Archimedes. Most inventive was Archimedes of Syracuse, 287 to 212. His main interest was in pure mathematics, in the exact measurement of the circle, the sphere, the cone, conoids, spheroids, and the cylinder. In some of his operations he has anticipated the principle of integral calculus, and in his applied mathematics he reveals a command of the principles of higher algebra. His work in applied science, though in his own judgment subsidiary, was in fact epoch-making. He discovered a means of computing the specific gravity of objects and of determining the center of gravity of complex forms. He invented engines for hurling great missiles with which his fellow citizens long kept at bay the besieging Romans, the helix for launching great ships and conveying other heavy weights, a pumping engine, and other useful machines. In the application of power, Archimedes and other ancient mechanics made use of water, compressed air, pneumatics, with levers, screws, and cogged wheels. Some inventions added to the conveniences of life, such as water mills, automatic door openers, washing machines. Others were for entertainment, including fountains adorned with automatically moving figurines, and an automatic theater in which the figures performed their parts through 5 complicated acts. Eratosthenes. The advance of mathematical and mechanical study inevitably led to a development of astronomy and of mathematical geography. The first Hellenistic master of this field was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, 275 to 195, the successor of Callimachus as chief librarian at Alexandria. There he was able to study the heavens in an observatory patterned after those of ancient Babylon. His most celebrated achievement was the computation of the circumference of the earth. By means of sundials placed at Syene and Alexandria, 5,000 stadia apart, he determined the positions of the sun from these 2 points, and with the angle thus formed, he computed the earth's circumference at 250,000 stadia, which is a 7th part in excess of the true distance of 25,000 English miles. He wrote a History of Geography, from Homer to his own day, in which he recognized the limitations of earlier authors. It included his own map of the world with an explanation of it, in which he expressed the possibility of reaching India by sailing west across the Atlantic, providing the distance should not prove too great an obstacle. His achievements were vast and so accurate that until the beginning of modern times no improvements were made upon them except in the correction and addition of minor geographical details. Aristarchus of Samos. Ptolemaic System. No long time afterward, Aristarchus of Samos, circa 280, brought astronomy to the highest reach attained by the ancients. He discovered that the volume of the sun is many times greater than that of the world. It was this fact that led him ultimately to the conclusion that the earth annually revolves round the sun in the circumference of a circle, in the center of which the sun remains fixed. The discovery was too brilliant for acceptance, and the theory of the spheres continued with an important modification. Instead of assigning a plurality of spheres to the planet, it was found more practicable to assume that each planet moved in a little circle, whose center lay in a larger circle surrounding the earth. This theory of epicycles, circles upon circles, prevailed, and was accepted by the Egyptian Claudius Ptolemy, an encyclopedic compiler of sciences who flourished in the 2nd century A.D. After him it came to be known as the Ptolemaic system, and held its place till overthrown by Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. Zoology and Botany. The permeation of Egypt and Western Asia by the Greeks brought to their knowledge a vast number of animals and plants, hitherto unknown to them, and the Ptolemies maintained a zoological garden at Alexandria. In spite of these opportunities, however, zoology and botany failed to make an appreciable advance beyond the works of Aristotle and Theophrastus. People had but a curious interest in animals, whereas botany was more vigorously studied as an auxiliary to medicine. A limited number of plants and animals had to be taken into account in scientific agriculture, horticulture, beekeeping, and stock breeding, all of which were diligently cultivated. The loss of all the books in these fields, with the exception of a few fragments, has left us ignorant of Hellenic intelligence in one of its most useful departments. Vivisection. The growth of civilization and the urbanization of mankind makes an ever-increasing demand upon the physician for hygienic regulations and for the cure of new diseases. Acquaintance with the Egyptian custom of embalming expelled from the minds of Greek physicians their last scruples against the dissection of the human body. For the first time in history, vivisection was practiced on condemned criminals furnished to the physicians by the Egyptian king. The result was an advance in anatomy and physiology which made an epoch in the history of medical science. Difficult and dangerous surgical operations could now be performed without pain to the patient, for anesthetics were now known and administered. Herophilus, his great achievements in medical science. The leading physician of this age was Herophilus of Chalcedon, whose achievement was to bring medical science to a height never exceeded by the ancients. Much of the progress summed up in the preceding paragraph was due to him. He discovered that the brain is the seat of the mind, and that the nerves, branching out from the brain and the spine, are the medium for the conveyance of sensation and will power respectively. His study of the eye is noteworthy. In his diagnosis of ailments, for which he was especially famous, he discovered the value of pulsation, which became the chief criterion of the patient's condition. Whereas other physicians believed that the arteries were normally filled with air, Herophilus discovered that they contain blood, which they convey from the heart to all parts of the body. In other words, he discovered substantially the circulation of the blood. Without neglecting diet and exercise for the cure of illness, he laid great stress on drugs, especially vegetable medicines, as the hands of God. Unfortunately, Herophilus was too far in advance of his age to find complete acceptance. The most eminent physician after him, Erasistratus of Chios, insisted that the arteries were normally filled with air, and that the presence of blood in the arteries is a system of illness. In other respects he made actual improvements upon Herophilus, as in his greater stress on hygiene and his clearer distinction between sensory and motor nerves. Opposed to the teachings of these eminent scientists were the empiricists, who, rejecting all reason, depended wholly on experimentation. There were charlatans, too, as at present, and despite all intellectual progress, incubation and magical cures persisted. 3. Hellenistic literature. New literary treatment. For an appreciation of the artistic literature, it is necessary to take account of the general environment, especially the intense urbanization of the Greeks, the growth of libraries, the keen interest in science and erudition. The mental attitude was essentially an appreciation of the past and an effort to master its vast intellectual treasures. The originality of the age, the achievement of adding to the accumulated store of knowledge, has been seen in its scientific discoveries and mechanical inventions. In literature, we shall find analogous efforts manifested in imitations of the past and in the working out of new problems suggested by the greatly changed environment. It was inevitable that the polite literature should taste of erudition, that it should be labored and pedantic. The generality of men, however, who lived in a highly artificial atmosphere, longed for diversion and rest, the freshness of nature, and at the same time the spirit of science was experimenting with emotions hitherto but little used. Far from being decadent, therefore, the period saw the beginning of a new literary treatment of nature and men. The novel element in nature is the environment of common people, of shepherds, ploughmen, and charcoal burners, refreshed with the dew and clear in the sunlight of morning. The new force in humankind is romantic love between man and woman. Theocritus, Sicilian poet. These are prominent features in the Sicilian Theocritus, about 305 to 250, the last Greek classic, and the first and greatest of Hellenistic poets. His creation, the Idyll, is a short poem exquisitely wrought. It possesses a wide range of character, epic, lyric, and dramatic. Preferably, his idylls treat of common persons in rural scenes, and hence have been described as pastoral. Though he lived his later years at the court of the Ptolemies, he drew his inspiration from the lovely air and the beautiful landscapes of Sicily, which wafted through his sweet poems, refreshing breezes with delicious memories of cool shade of green fields and radiant flowers into the dusty streets and arid studios of Alexandria. Callimachus. Whereas Theocritus stands at the threshold of Alexandrian life, Callimachus occupies its inmost shrine. Already noticed as chief librarian and a man of vast learning, he is equally conspicuous as a poet of stupendous productivity. His own writings are said to have filled 800 books, rolls. Of all these works there remain a few hymns and epigrams. The hymns are courtly, composed for royal occasions. With great talent the author creates brilliant effects for their own sake. Doubtless there is feeling in the poet, but it is hidden in the elaborate apparatus of his song. At the same time he was proclaimed the greatest master of elegy. This form of poetry was used for the expression of sentiment on all subjects, and in this age particularly, mythical tales of love. The epigrams show him to better advantage. They are in the elegiac metre, but are short and highly polished. Usually the epigram expresses an occasional sentiment of the author on any subject that attracted his attention. A large anthology of epigrams, which has been preserved, includes the contributions of many unknown and anonymous poets. They are a valuable source for social conditions and sentiments. Didactic verse, the romantic epic. In didactic verse the spirit of scholarship prevails. The aim is to teach, and the lines are without imagination or charm. This kind of poem remained dead till the Roman Lucretius endowed it with life and power. Quite different is the romantic epic represented by the Argonautica of Apollonius, an emigrant from Alexandria to Rhodes. This work is a long narrative of a popular myth, the quest for the Golden Fleece. In this respect it is an imitation of the past, an echo from Homer. In his presentation of Medea's love for Jason, the analysis of its origin and growth and conflict with duty, the author has created a new theme, but one oft treated from that day to this. Although the poet lacked the genius for making it a success, the work has a value in illustrating the intellectual efforts of the period, and in the suggestion it offered to Virgil for his Aeneid, an incomparably superior work. End of chapter 30. End of Hellenic History by George Willis Botsford.